Hello. Sorry about that, everyone. We're back. Hopefully, there won't be any more issues. Thank you very much for your patience. And if you can share the stream, it's always nice to have people in the chat contributing to the conversation. It's tough for me to reshare it once the show's going. So, all right. Let's check, or can just wait a minute to see if it looks like we are successfully live now. So it's doing the little twirly thingy where it's thinking. So you want to go ahead? I think we are live.
Yeah, I mean, it hasn't popped up as live yet. So we'll see.
Okay.
Wait a second. If you want to talk a minute, well.
Sure. Yeah, I just want to make sure that there's no actual, what do you want to call it? I want to make sure there's no, yeah. So we're back. We're back. Can you see it, or we got, yeah, so it looks like people are saying we're live. So I apologize for that. Again, thanks for coming back, and thanks for your patronage. And yeah, over to you, Doovid. Sorry for the interruption.
Okay, yeah, so sorry about that. Boomer Tech.
Ha.
Or low birth, or whatever it is. So
yes, when people think of Jen Sharp, they think she's so shit with tech.
Or just took low birth, God forbid. Okay, it's still okay. I'll put up. It's still not showing up. Okay, so I was going to do the song this week. Tiny Dancer, Elton John. On Wikipedia, one of the 50th most famous songs ever. I was mentioning before it went down. We got Gandalf here. He's back.
It's Gandalf from the Cade People, by the way.
That in the similar way to Wayne's World revived Queen with Bohemian Rhapsody, Elton John was always pretty popular. But to help popularize this song, it wasn't one of his more popular songs originally, but it ended up like now it may actually even be his single most popular song. Tiny Dancer is from Madman Across the Water 1971. It wasn't even released in a single due to its unusual structure. And, so here's an interesting video I found on the musical structure of, just share this on my Facebook, on the musical structure of Tiny Dancer, and say usually, don't bore us, get to the chorus. Most songs get to the chorus right away. And if you look at Elton John, Tiny Dancer, it takes a full 3 minutes to get to the chorus. And so that's generally why it wasn't so popular in the beginning. It wasn't released as a single in the 70s when it came out. Most songs were relatively short, and it's a 6-minute song, but it's a repeat. And so there's an interesting video about the making of the song and the structure of the song. The song is in C major also. It has a little musical shift from the before the chorus into minor to put back into major, the general hero's journey structure. And the chorus is very high and popular to sing. And also interesting, if people are into the American politics, is that President Trump Donald Trump was friends and a big Elton John fan, even though Elton John's a liberal and didn't like President Trump, at least politically. And at his rallies, he would play Elton John songs. I guess Elton John doesn't own his own music or sold his music. And so he was able to play his music without Elton John's permission. And if people remember the famous news story when President Trump heard that Ruth Bader Ginsburg, God forbid, had passed away, that Elton John's Tiny Dancer was in the background. And it's almost like movie-esque in a picture. He's coming up to the media and you could hear the song starting of Tiny Dancer as President Trump is walking up to the media, and they're like, Ruth Bader Ginsburg has died. And, he says, oh, she was a great woman. And, God forbid, like, they want to replace her and various politics. But, so the song has some uh, political significance. There are even articles. Elton John tried to get President Trump to be able to stop playing the song at his rallies, or at least supposedly. So I thought I'd do this popular song, one of the 50th most popular songs ever. And I guess I'll skip a tiny bit of it from the beginning. It starts in C major and then has a little bridge to the chorus that goes into minor, back into C major at a higher key, the basics of theme and variation, hero's journey. Blue jean baby, LA lady, seamstress for the band, pretty eyed, pirate smile, you married a music man. Ballerina, you must have seen her dancing in the sand. And now she's in me, always with me, tiny dancer in my hand. Jesus freaks out on the street, handing tickets out for God. Actually, say 1972, they refused to play the song on the radio because the Jesus freaks line at that point was too controversial for the radio. Turning back, she just laughs. The boulevard is not that bad. Piano man, he makes a stand in the auditorium, looking on. She sings the songs, the world she knows, the tune she hums. But oh, how it feels so real, lying here with no one near, only you, and you could hear me when I say softly, slowly, hold me closer, tiny dancer. Count the headlights on the highway. Lay me down in sheets of linen. You had a busy day today. Okay, so that was Doovid's, I guess, poor attempt at Elton John there, one of the 50th most popular songs ever. Relatively simple song, um, enjoyable song. So it's random that that song is so popular. Uh, Before I end the screen share, let me look real quick here at.
I think it's because a lot of people think that he's saying Tony Danza instead of Tiny Dancer, and that guy was like kind of a household name for a while. So he was in one of those really popular like sitcom shows.
I
Everybody
think
watched
that's in the
like
80s. I mean, Tiny
TGIF.
Dancer is 1972, but it becomes repopularized. And then in 2000, it becomes repopularized from Almost Famous. And at that point, Tony Danza is not even that well known. But yeah, there was a period of that. I had to look in the lyrics. I didn't even realize what the lyrics were until I looked it up. But so I thought it had a little interesting history. One of the say Elton John, Pigger, Rock On. Okay, so here's the free energy principle: Markov blankets, graphical models, and predictive coding uh, for perception. Markov blanket is a statistical boundary, parent children and parents of children with internal states, external states, sensory states, and active states. So the Markov blanket is one of the main mathematical models of Carl Friston's materialistic, even eliminativistic materialistic model of consciousness, where you have external states and internal states and a feedback mechanism of active states and sensory states using, I think, Markov uh, is a Russian mathematician. I think he was born in the 1800s and passes away maybe before World War II. So here you any ergo, er, ergo, ergodic random dynamic system that possesses a Markov blanket will appear to actively maintain its structural and dynamic integrity. So the purpose of these Markov blankets is they have self-correcting feedback mechanisms, and this would be in a mathematical algorithm that would be capable of being demonstrated in circuit logic that's used in computers. And so this is a reverse anthropomorphization where you have these mathematical algorithms that exist before the computer era that have a self-correcting mechanism that are reverse anthropomorphized to possibly explain the the brain. And here's some precursors: Pavlov, Barlow, Ashby, and Helmholtz. So Helmholtz had already talked about the possibility of these mathematical models and active inference in the brain. The famous Bayesian is already 250 years ago. The Bayesian statistics. Bayes was not famous in his lifetime, and his mathematics became famous after he had passed away from a letter that he'd written. I think Bayes was a member of the Royal Society of London. So we're really talking about information theory being applied to the brain. And so here's some cool graphics. So the existence of a Markov blanket necessarily implies a partition of states into internal states. The Markov blanket censoring active states and external or hidden states, because active states change but are not changed by external states. They minimize the entropy of internal states and their Markov blanket. This means action will appear to maintain the structural and functional integrity of the Markov blanket, referred to as autopoiesis. Internal states appear to infer the hidden causes of sensory states by maximizing Bayesian evidence and influence those causes through action. And that's referred to as active inference, which is Carl Friston's mainstream consciousness theory. Objects, so here's Helmholtz quotes: objects are always imagined as being present in the field of vision as would have to be there in order to produce the same impression of the nervous mechanism. And Richard Feynman also has some uh, developments for the Markov blanket. Here's a mathematical formulation and showing like the feedback mechanism of perception, prediction, error, action. As this is kind of like the predictive brain, where through this algorithm of Markov blankets, that the brain could make predictions and then constantly be self-correcting itself, and in a theory that doesn't even require strong emergence, as we were mentioning earlier, that the Markov blanket theory of from Carl Friston, active interference, is largely an eliminativistic, materialistic model that doesn't even necessitate strong emergence, and it's a hierarchical generative model that would have, so to say, layers of ascending and descending prediction errors and corrections. And then here would be a model of where these algorithmic functions would likely to be being occur in the brain. So biological agents minimize their average surprise entropy. They minimize surprise by suppressing prediction error. Prediction error can be reduced by changing predictions. It's perception. Prediction error can be reduced by changing sensations. Action. Perception entails recurrent message passing to optimize predictions. Action makes predictions come true and minimizes entropy surprise. So that also would refer to like reflexes or non-conscious uh, movement, different forms of sense perception. So here's another quote from Helmholtz: each movement we make by which we alter the appearance of objects should be thought of as an experiment designed to test whether we have understood correctly the invariant relationship of the phenomenon before us, that is, their existence in definite spatial relations. So a little overview. I'm going to be going into more detail over the next few weeks of active interference. I plan on watching all of the videos on the channel. So with that finishes my week in review presentation. I think Jennifer has her own week in review presentation this week. Did you have like a news? Did you want to go through like the news story of the links that you have in the chat?
Sure.
Okay,
Just
so I'm going to mute myself and eat some grapes while you do that. And then hopefully we'll go to my blog post on 3D printing.
cool. That'll be fun. All right, just got to reload the thing here due to the, the whole crash thing. So I'm just talking to the audience, so feel free to go and grab your
Nibble my
food.
muscat grapes, my wine grapes. Doooovid loves having wine grapes. Muscat grapes are some of my favorites. I occasionally eat like champagne grapes, but champagne grapes are more expensive and not as available as often. So I usually have muscat grapes. And champagne grapes are actually very small, as opposed to muscat grapes are almost regular size.
Always good to know the trivia. Never know when that's going to come in handy. Memes of Destruction has interesting combos. I mean, everybody has a different place they can start. I'm not saying everyone's going to have some special insight there, but he does have a patience that I perhaps lack at times. There is perhaps no perhaps about it. But people keep calling me a he on the combos that I'm having, and it's like, how should I react? And I guess I've just been thinking about that. And in conjunction with this whole, like, are we who we define ourselves to be in our own sort of dialogue or monologue or self-monologue, or however you want to put it. Whatever words to it, words can't really fully get to it. Like, are we what we think about ourselves or what other people think about us? So it's just one of those, like, it's a binding problem question. It's like, it's meant to point to what it means for self, like, what is self-actualization? So I've got this. I like to do stuff with my writing sometimes. Like, Doooovid's just getting started on writing, so it's really fun to see someone who's actually got skill for it progress through the stages or whatever. But for me, it's always a bit, a lot, and by a bit I mean a lot, frustrating. So I have to keep doing stuff to, like, keep myself, like, entertained. I just noticed that since my computer crashed, I have to reanalyze the results. Anyway, so I just little things, like word clouds, for example. You take, it doesn't really work for super short articles, but for a certain length of an article of a certain degree of monotonousness, if that's a term, it does sort of, I don't know if anyone's familiar with Malcolm Gladwell. I sort of dip into his stuff a lot because he's very insightful, like the thin slicing thing. The word cloud's a great way to thin slice. And thin slicing your own stuff when you suck at writing can sometimes be awesome. So anyway, blah, blah, blah. All that to say that I finally got the thing working here. The computer says the verdict of me, informally, 87% male. And formally, 81% male. So I don't know what the point of this is. There's nothing really to say about it other than it was a curiosity that happened. All right, I have, like, I don't even know really what to say about this article. It's in the description, and now for some reason, like, every article I'm loading is just not loading. I guess because my computer crashed. Like, I got to reload every last one of these articles individually now. It's just going to be a blank screen.
No screen share due to your boomer tech.
Well, there's like a sampling feedback problem where I guess it's like a limitation of the, I don't know, rendering capacity of the computer itself. So it was bound to run up against limitations at some point. I don't think I ever actually went over this article here. And I'm not saying like that people should read every single article that has the word quantum in it, but it's interesting from the perspective of if you actually fancy yourself, you know, any type of a historical scientist, or I mean, everybody seems to want to jump to the last level of like passing moral judgment, but I think that's sort of not good. Moral equals emotional equals, you know, T jump sort of being right by accident. Sometimes we can't really trust emotions, but we have them, and they're the majority of the processing. So that's sort of a, how do you deal with that? Well, you have to understand the different types of information that emotions can give you, and from that, redirect them towards philosophy, not redirect philosophy towards your emotional biases. Yeah, so there's a lot of this stuff that I'm perfectly fine to read about, but at some point, you know, what is the metaphor of the square circle saying, really? What is being alluded to? It sort of seems like at some point, what's being said is quite hypnotic. It's like something, 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 something. And there's not. It doesn't flow. A lot of these arguments, they just don't flow to me. Like it's very much comes across as this is the conclusion, and it was worked backwards from to get what sounded like a reasonable presumption about it, and that's the way the reasoning comes across. Or negative axioms, which at some point it's just needs to be acknowledged that the negation of an axiom inherits more metaphysics than a positive axiom structurally. It doesn't matter what the content of the axiom is. So I do encourage people to read this stuff just to see like what people have thought about these questions, but also like this article's, it's if you just read one, it goes against the whole point of it. The whole point of reading these articles is not to say, oh, there's an understanding in particular this article has. It's no, it's like, what is the fact that articles like this are being written now that weren't being written 5 years ago? Where's the knowledge, like, where's the growth and understanding coming from? And how do material experiments versus metaphysical framing affect the process of science? Yeah, so Meme says he thought the square circles thing was a ring. Here's the problem: abusive metaphor. Just citing a random analogy, like saying the map is not the territory. Okay, that's, I've said this before, and there's sometimes when it's fine to say, but like uh using metaphors to sound smart is against the intention of traditional proofs, and anything going against the intention of traditional proofs is sort of doesn't look great. So
I'm not sure if you're clicking your head thing again. We're getting some of those clicking sounds. If you're bumping your headset or something like that.
thank you for pointing that out. Is it still doing it? Can you hear anything?
It
Is
wasn't
it
that
still
bad, but
clicking?
like every like 10, 20 seconds, there was a
Sure,
few
but is
clicks.
it still clicking? Okay, well, please let me know if it happens again. I'll just try to remain absolutely still. My bad. So the point here it means is that the square circle thing doesn't point to anything. It is itself a metaphor. It may not even be a complete metaphor. It's just something that we cannot really point to what that means. We can point to a square circle as something that is an example of, it's almost like it's evidence in support of another thesis. And then if someone's going to come in with a negation as that thesis, what I'm saying is that that is itself a fallacy. Spatial dependent quantum dot photon entangling via tunneling effect. So people, I'm very happy to see that entanglement finally has been accepted axiomatically, but like systems are entangled. It's just a question of how are they entangled, right? So what's the best what's the optimum partition? It's not, oh, we can entangle a system. Like you can't artificially impose entanglement on a system any more than you can create wave equations as a function of the effing emergent, okay, the things that don't have causal powers can't be used to model the things that do due to the perfect compression attributes to the universe. Anyway, long story short, entanglement is the default position and measurement changes entanglement. So measurement gives you an access to a different state of entanglement that may be in a better, more preferable entropy configuration, okay? So I use entropy as a shorthand, but really what it's just configuration. And the set of all configurations, how do we get the set of all configurations? Well, you guessed it, obviously something to do with our BFF, the QMPT. It's just sort of like a shorthand of, well, on that one sort of thin slice of reality, there's that much information, whatever that means, that much structure, and then strong inference step to say, okay, well, anyway, we thin slice reality. That's actually a complete thin slice, has the same cardinality, whatever that means, and that it's a guiding principle rather than an actual formula, which I think is something I want to come to. Also super important that like we've gotten ultra dumb from, I don't want to just say smartphones, but technology can make us dumb because we're delegating stuff to it that, like, are we really thinking about what it means to add numbers together if you're doing it on an abacus? No, you're using the abacus as shorthand for something you don't want to think about. Like you're compounding the thing that you don't want to think about by using more sophisticated calculators. I don't know if that's clear. Please stop me if it's not clear. Anyway, I want to make it so that this doesn't happen. And I think that
the clicking's coming back. I'm not sure if
okay.
it's something physically you're doing or.
It's because I'm moving and it's moving the, I think I got it though. I just have to hold the cable in one hand. My bad. I get excited and then I start shifting around. I think that's what's going on anyway. And I have restless legs sometimes. So there you go. Okay. I need to stretch more, I suppose. So my point with all that was, yeah, framing, blah, blah, blah. For magical number 7 plus or minus 2, we've gone over this, right? I just thought it was worth mentioning again.
Yeah, it's in my memory technique. I even mentioned the Miller experiment. I'm not sure if you, that was in my essay a month ago. I mentioned the Miller experiment many times, that the limitations of short-term memory are the basis of chunking theory.
Well, that's where the 7, I mean, we've talked about this tons because that's where the 7 thing came from, right?
The concept of 7 plus or minus 2 being the limitation of short-term memory was first conducted in the Miller experiment, and confirmed by many tests. I think Miller was already in the 1950s. But although there's no physical basis to demonstrate that that's all psychometric, all of the tests demonstrating the limitation of short-term memory.
Okay, but the way I see it is that the psychometric data is in some level physical data. It's connected to, it's cross-correlational, it's meta, it's a pattern that can be noticed throughout experiments, regardless of the intention of discovering it. It was a meta-analytically
you argue the opposite
thing.
Like,
sorry?
Like you argue the opposite, like many times when, like in the past, when I was trying to explain psychometrics, but yeah, it's the product of the
I think
mind.
that was a misunderstanding on a definitional level, frankly. I'm still not sure if it's resolved actually at this point. Like, on
And if
what
you're not
level was the
measuring mind, you're
scientific
measuring the
discovery
product of
made?
mind.
Sorry?
Because psychometrics is the measurement of the product of mind. So it's an inference about mind itself, and it's the measurement of the product of mind.
I agree with that. I agree with that. The scientific discovery, in my understanding, is that when you see 7 manifesting across many studies, unintentionally, quote unquote, like without the intention of finding 7, that's the finding. That's like science, quote unquote, because it can be
It's like
replicated.
cognitive dissonance that stands the test into the neurological age of cognitive sciences, that there's no physical neural mechanism that we know and understand why there should be a limit of 7. But
No, I'm not saying that that's what they discovered. What they discovered was the evidence of a limit existing, not an explanation as to why the limit existed. It's very sound basis for a theory is sort of the point. And I want to just get to, on what level is it science and on what level is it framing, and how the 7 joins the 2. Because you can replicate, like the 7 self-replicated across experiments, and it was noted by someone retroactively upon a corpus of data. Not just any type of data either, data derived through a class of experiments. So yeah, thanks for clearing that up and everything. So I've got Medium here talking about, I'm basically interested in any time I hear panpsychism, because again, it's sort of verging on theological understanding of things. And I guess in my view, theology is the only thing that's really more fundamental than philosophy. Like, I'd even go as far, I'd define philosophy as like secular theology. Excuse me. So anytime I hear words in this general, like just pretty much anything about consciousness framed in such a way that, it's not just a pure negation, because obviously, traditionally there is a process of negation. It's integral. Like, we can't sort of, like, there's a balance between what can be established to exist and what doesn't exist. So what does exist has dependent arising on what doesn't exist. And there's this whole inheritance basically every time, the whole, I guess I always found the whole apple pie from scratch, invent the universe thing's a bit cheesy, but I think what he's driving at, maybe if I'm going to skill man it, is that like you inherit the entire, it's not just a couple of random assumptions, you're inheriting an entire framing every time you really speculate anything that isn't, I suppose the word would be uncontroversial. What is colloquially meant by data, like what comes out, like the fact that 25 degrees is warmer than 20, I always harken back to this one. That's not disputed. That's also not the domain of philosophy. There, to do that is, again, sort of an abuse of the process, and it's going against the intention of the process, which is to discover fundamentals. And to only really invoke secular language if absolutely necessary, like, I guess maybe this is controversial, but I understand philosophy is necessarily reductive, in the sense that if you're going to talk about a topic, you can't expect that you're going to be able to do it in terms of just an ordinary secular language. And I guess my example I would point to is like, well, we have awareness, self, consciousness, and on and on. At what point, like, do we want to assume what they mean? Do we want to try to get rid of every word except one, so that if there's a mistake and we go to do some stuff, because we have to sort of make the strong inductive leap at some point, but if we did make a fudge up, we want to be able to correct it quickly. So it's sort of an argument like, do we want to have one fudge up that propagates across the entire system, that we can sort of trace it. And it's like, okay, well, I just have to go in and quick, like fix a teeny little thing, and it's going to domino. The correction is going to domino, and on and on and on. So just the direction to be thinking in. I'm hoping this is making my whole thing more clear over time. How complex is it not? New proof reveals ranking system that works. I am so into this because I've been working on a physical numerical model for a while. Again, with the sidebar that if it's not conducive pedagogically, I'm going to sort of put the brakes on until I can figure out a way that it is. And I don't mind being patient because, like, frankly, there's a lot's been done in not that much time if you look at it from a big perspective in terms of things, you know. Anyway, there's an issue because, like, it's in the knots in topology. There's the U knot, which is self-connected, and then it jumps from that to the trefoil knot. So there's sort of like a missing knot that looks Mobius strip-ish. And that's not to say there's something wrong with topology per se. Like there's something right about topology, but then there's some stuff that we're not quite putting it together correctly. I don't know if that's going to be, again, an axiomatic change or some sort of like a redefinition thing on a slightly different, what amounts to not being an axiomatic thing. Because what's axiomatic in one system tends to not be in another. Like what axioms can be reasonably, that's connected, but they're not always the same in every system. So, you know, sort of pulling back to this idea about the 7, you needed to do more than one experiment to get that data about the 7 and to see that the data of the 7 was important. And sometimes you got to sort of have a bunch of experiments to crystallize these greater ordering principles, which brought me to another conversation about the general topic of determinism. Something I want to go into for a while, but like, what does it mean for a system to be deterministic? And is that effectively the same thing as randomness? It's a big question. Obviously, these things always come down to definition. So we sort of, it's like a bit of a blender. You know, you want to go blender sometimes and take some positions that are wrong. You know they're wrong, you know why they're wrong, but you know something in it that's not wrong, so you sort of check. I don't want to say a checksum because I'm just literally that bad at coding that I literally don't even understand the terms. So I'm at your article in my list of articles. I don't know if you wanted to do a digression or if you wanted me to keep blowing through these. It's just going to, it's like I feel like I'm pretty boring already at what I'm saying, unless there's like questions in the audience specifically about technical stuff that I can answer. Like, I don't really honestly even know what to say about these things because they're all just like little anecdotes about framing the question better. So how are you feeling?
Just do it like a newscast, just you know, go through and you know, like the writing exercise, you know, like a sentence or two, why you're bringing up, why it's interesting, explain it, a few thoughts, and then on to the next. And then, you know, if it's worth discussing or asking questions, you do that after you finish your whole.
All right, so let's see what we have. Quantum sense for dark matter. So someone who was very close and almost had the same theory as me is Emmy Noether. Like, obviously no one's going to agree with me on that, but technically I feel that there's a lot of similarities because she talked about symmetries and conservation laws. And I'm just basically going one step further and saying independent arising, therefore entanglement, therefore interferential observation, which changes the overall distribution of the quote simulation that allows a energetically more favorable array within this quote unquote, I don't like to say supersymmetric because there's already a context with that, but you know what I mean, that there is sort of it's hard to say that when we're looking at something like the QMPT that it's anything other than supersymmetric. So, all right, so my thing has decided to freeze now, unfortunately. I don't know how long it's come back. Great. I'll just close these out then. So I'm hoping what'll happen is that people will configure AI to go through cosmological data to get the AI to spit out a predictive or adaptive predictive model with a low number of basically something that's been through brute force iteration optimized for a particular type of convergence. I sent you this article. I was really excited about it. RIT offers new minor and emerging field of quantum information science and tech. That'll be a good one to follow over the years. And it sort of comes back to another idea that we had a while ago that we haven't gone back to on the show for a while because people aren't super interested in math at this point, but hopefully that'll change, is the RK selection theory and how you can take your generalized RK graph, okay? So just want to be able to pull that shape up in your head and then just rotate that around the x-axis. So what does that give you? Almost kind of looks like what? A cup, right? So it's a sort of a Gabriel's horn. You can compare it with Gabriel's horn. It's a similar, but very different. It's not identical at all, but very sort of similar in how you could construct it mathematically if you're already familiar with math. What do I know about a transhumanism agenda? Okay, so here's the thing, like there's that, don't attribute to malice, which you can attribute to stupidity. Models only go so far, okay? So there's definitely a huge amount of people who want to shirk death or live forever or something. There's just a certain okay, I'm sort of off in the weeds here, but there's a dread of death that we can all probably relate to some extent, and we all cope to whatever extent differently. And sometimes the coping is just works on one scale but not on other, and so there is some model adjusting that is just sort of hard for humans to do because we have a belief in a continuous self, and changing beliefs. If one of your beliefs is that yourself is continuous, in fact, that's your strongest belief, well, derivative beliefs would not be so easy to alter, and it's unclear to what extent those beliefs are powered subconsciously. So a distinction without a difference, switch, map territory fallacy, those do apply on the level of what we tell ourselves is true about the meaning in language. So I am very excited to see where this goes. Next thing that I thought was super interesting pedagogically was tricolorability. It was sort of attached to that proof about the knots, and basically a unified theory of information. What do we mean by information? We mean data that's stored in a form. What do you mean by form? Things that emits a geometric decomposition. What's a geometry? Well, it's sort of a primitive, but it's something that can be represented with Plato. Not like the Platonic thing. I'm literally talking about Plato, the stuff that we played with before GAC and Flom, which I know at least one person in the audience, and that's me, knows what I'm talking about. Let's see what else says. I actually apologize if we've already been over this. Did you bring up a not geometry PDF? Because I can't recall if I got that from you or from this other
Not sure.
group. All right, well, it's no, you don't remember doing a presentation on not geometry.
I have mentioned that I have books on it. I mean, it's definitely a topic of even how you mathematically define the functions, you use parametric or shape. So I'm not sure that if it's possible, but it's not ringing a bell.
Oh yeah, I realized I was not even done answering the transhumanism question. People tend to throw money at stuff that they wish was true if they have money to burn. And, I think the level on which it's creepy is that there have been human clones before. It went horribly, arguably was one of the reasons the Muhammadat started. And so there's all this, if you kind of buy into that stuff about even something as basic as a Jungian collective unconscious, excuse me if I'm remembering that wrong, but it's sort of implied that what's happened in the past informs the creep factor of the present due to like what drives the pattern recognition and the intrinsic pattern recognition, right? So no, it's not that. It's just that to call it an agenda is sort of paralyzing yourself against actually improving things. Because why is it an agenda? Well, if it is one, it's just basically the I don't want to die agenda. Okay, so we want to reframe it. Why is the why the I don't want to die agenda taken this form? Well, it's pretty obvious that like there's a surplus of technologies, and it would seem that there's a desire to push it to the limit, and that would just appear to be a biological imperative. So it's the things that like seem dangerous about what people are calling transhumanism. If you want to be less afraid, that actually comes with more knowledge, because you can realize what the computer can do, and at some level, sort of like being afraid of a calculator, it's not understanding the level on which there's weakness, because it's ultimately a lack of a self-understanding. And I thought this was so incredibly cool. Like, what did you think of the AI boxing?
Yeah, it was an interesting video,
Oh
and
my God.
you know, I've mentioned similar things.
It was just really neat because I was thinking about the model for, you know, the neurons being, in some sense, connected to the computational load of the human mind versus other minds, and how maybe the steps in the algorithm would be somehow modelable as the nervous system going through the process of learning a skill. So I was basically interested like on the very small amount of training data and how it was able to come up with, I guess it's, I hate to use, I know people don't like the term emergence, but you know, give me a better term, right? What appears to be complex behavior from simple training data, and how it's not really complex behavior. It only seems like it is. Like, it being afraid of transhumanism may only be as reasonable as being afraid of a bush moving at night and thinking that it's something that's not there when it's actually just the wind rustle, right? Where the, you know, often vote thing about why do we survive, you know, bonobo versus chimp. So there's sort of a balance of over and under determination. And I think the way the measurement limit can help us get smarter long term is if it's not fixed in a particular doctrine, if it's only ever used as a guiding principle, and something that, in the same vein as what was noticed with the 7 plus or minus 2 thing, it's noticed as a conclusion, almost like with God. Like, I can come in and say, oh, quantum periodic tables prove God. Has that actually convinced anyone? Probably somebody got convinced over time, partially because the QMPT, partially due to my own dogged annoyance, but whatever. But like, I don't think that's ever been the sole factor in like shifting anyone's sort. Anyway, I love this. Check it out. It's great. And I guess these are other articles, but I didn't share them in the description. So I guess I should probably wrap here because my voice is also somewhat dying. So do you want to maybe like go to your article for a bit?
Okay, yeah, those clickings are coming back. So if it's you know, something like you're holding a microphone, just whatever you do that causes it, if you just be cognizant. Okay, so you wanted me to just read my article, or you lost your voice to
Can you read the first half and I'll read the second half? I just need like a little drink.
Okay, so I'll put in the chat again. So I showed them a link of the 3D printing. We talked about it last week a little bit. And yeah, I've been following this technology for a decade. It'll be in the article, and it's awesome stuff. So usually I've been writing about cognitive psychology, things related to consciousness. This doesn't really have anything to do with consciousness, but I figure, it's math and science related. So here we go. 3D printing and additive manufacturing. 3D printing. This week I attended the Society for Manufacturing Engineers Rapid TCT conference in Detroit. And I think TCT is a magazine on additive manufacturing. I've attended the SME conference in the past and closely followed 3D printing technologies for over a decade now. I remember going to one of the first Stratasys distribution centers in Metro Detroit in 2013, hosted by the Michigan Israel Business Bridge and many other early technology demonstrations of 3D printers. I took a training course at the now bankrupt Tech Shop on how to work a 3D printer before they were widely available, and remember when the University of Michigan Engineering School got its first 3D printer. The concept was incredible, and I almost sought employment as a 3D printer salesman. In my work as an engineer over the last 10 years, 3D printing is the sector that I personally witnessed the fastest growth from its first appearance to now a major conference completely dedicated to the field. Prices have radically dropped to hundreds of dollars from tens of thousands of dollars, as well as new capabilities such as metal printers. In this week's essay, I will explain the basic technology behind 3D printing, additive manufacturing, the major different methods 3D printers use, trace the origins of the 3D printer technology from early conceptions and first patents to commercial introduction for industrial use for research and development to the more widespread use over the last few years. Finally, I will cover the main uses of the technology and its future direction. 3D printing or additive manufacturing is a process of making a three-dimensional solid object from a digital file. The term 3D printing can refer to a variety of processes where material is deposited, joined, or solidified to create a three-dimensional object. The process can use a variety of materials from plastics, liquids, powders, metals, food, concrete, biomaterials, and more. Common techniques to accomplish 3D printers are fused deposit modeling, stereolithography, selective laser sintering, and binder jetting. Additive manufacturing is simply an expansion of regular two-dimensional inkjet printing to the third dimension. Fused deposit modeling is done by feeding in material, heating the material to melt, and pushing through an extruder that deposits the melted material in a computer-controlled head that goes up and down the XY plane, depositing the material as per the model, layer by layer. The layering is usually on a platform that lowers after each layer is finished, but different machines utilize various methods. Stereolithography, instead of extruding a material, focuses a laser on a power bed of material, causing it to fuse with the platform that lowers or raises after finishing a layer. Similar to stereolithography, selective laser sintering uses two or more lasers and is more common for metal additive manufacturing. Binder jetting, instead of using a laser, uses a liquid binding agent on a powder bed, requiring less energy and often being more cost effective. The general concept of 3D printing is simple and intuitive. Sister technologies to 3D printing are 3D scanning and modeling software. 3D scanners can create a computer image by scanning an object, which can then be printed, a form of reverse engineering. Additive manufacturing technology is dependent on 3D modeling software such as CAD, computer aided design, that is communicated from a computer to the various type printers, directing the shape to be made. Experts break down the historical development of 3D printing into three eras: the era of early ideas prior to around 1985, then the era of the first commercial printers before widespread acceptance through around 2010, and now the modern era of mass adoption. The concept of 3D printing existed over 100 years ago in the fields of typography and photo sculpture. Science fiction novels in the 1940s and 50s by Murray Leinster and Raymond Jones speculated about hypothetical devices. The inkjet printer was introduced in the 1950s, and the concept of 3D printing was not hard to extrapolate, but the needed technologies did not yet exist. In the 1970s, early patents were filed, and in 1974, British scientist David Jones wrote about the concept of 3D printing in The New Scientist. But it was not until the early 1980s that the technology to create a working 3D printer materialized by various researchers in America, Japan, and Europe. In 1984, Chuck Hull patented the stereolithography method in the US, which had been previously discovered and abandoned in France, together with the accompanying STL digital file format. Hull went on to found 3D Systems, one of the first companies to market 3D printers in 1987. In 1988, Scott Crump developed an alternative method of fused deposit modeling and founded the company Stratasys, which marketed their first printer in 1992. These earlier machines cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. Concurrently in Europe, Dr. Hans Larger created the company EOS in Germany and developed the laser sintering method. Throughout the 1990s, 3D printing was available at high prices, mostly used for rapid prototyping. The term 3D printing was popularized by MIT scientist Emanuel Sachs, a founder of Z Corporation, another earlier innovator in the field of additive manufacturing. The late 1990s also saw the first biomedical printing. In 2004, EOS marketed metal 3D printers, highly expensive and largely limited to industrial use. 3D printing technologies were extremely expensive and therefore limited until around 2010. In 2005, Dr. Adrian Bowyer of the University of Bath developed the RepRap project, replicating rapid prototyping, with the goal of developing affordable self-replicating 3D printers. RepRap was a nonprofit and open source organization. Some of the early members of RepRap founded MakerBot. Maker, the
Can
first
I take over? I meant to take over earlier, but it froze. I wanted to take over right at the beginning of that paragraph there, or did you want to just finish?
I'll finish this paragraph. So RepRap uh, was a nonprofit and open source organization. Some of the early members of RepRap founded MakerBot. Maker, the first affordable 3D printers marketed as a DIY do-it-yourself kits. MakerBot was acquired by Stratasys in 2013. In 2009, some of the original patents on additive manufacture technology expired, opening the markets to competitively priced printers, 3D printers. Many important technologies important to additive manufacture, like lasers and 3D scanners and modeling software, were further developed at the same time. In 2012, 3D Systems released a popular desktop 3D printer for $1,200. Cheaper prices allowed 3D printers to experience exponential growth. 3D printers first gained mass media attention in 2012 with the controversy about 3D printed guns and publicly available files from which anyone could download to print a working gun.
Okay. The US government was involved in 3D printing from the beginning. The National Science Foundation had partially funded 4 out of 6 of the major 3D printing processes, offering over 600 grants in excess of 200 million in the 1980s and 90s. Can you hear any clicking?
Thank God, no, not right
Okay.
now.
In 2012, President Obama created the National Additive Manufacturing Innovation Initiative and mentioned 3D printing in his 2013 State of the Union address. The Obama administration also helped found America Makes, a public-private partnership for additive manufacturing technology and education, helping to popularize 3D printing and advance its use in industry and education. 3D printing has seen rapid growth, doubling nearly every 3 years with double-digit growth rates. Now, hundreds of thousands of consumers are buying personal devices, and tens of thousands of industrial printers are sold every year. In 2019, over 1.1 billion was invested in additive manufacturers startups, with hundreds of new related patents filed every year. Over 50% of the 3D printing market is in the United States, and increases are expected to continue for decades. When 3D printing first became viable in the 1990s, it was used almost exclusively for rapid prototyping. Rapid prototyping are techniques used to create a scale model of a physical part using 3D computer design and 3D printing or additive manufacturing. Historically, to create a prototype was very costly and time consuming, either having to mill the part through subtractive manufacture or creating a mold to cast the part. Early 3D printers were almost exclusively in the research and development laboratories of major manufacturing corporations. The extremely high cost of the first printers was worthwhile because the high costs and time involved in using traditional methods to create prototypes. 3D printing also became economically viable for low run parts and for highly variable parts, like medical implants. Surgical implants need to be specific for the patient and can't be mass produced. Thus, dentistry was an eager adapter of 3D printing, where the dentist could 3D scan the patient's teeth and print the implant instead of casting a mold, making even early, extremely expensive 3D metal printing economically viable. In the last few years, rapid improvements in 3D printing have made 3D printing economically viable for industrial manufacture, but the 3D printing process is still relatively slow, and parts need finishing after printing. It's unlikely in the near term 3D printing will displace traditional injection molding for mass runs. At present, it is only useful for highly configurable parts in small runs. 3D printing has also made a large impact in biomedical engineering, creating regenerative tissues capable of mimicking and replacing damaged tissues. 3D printers can be fitted with biocompatible ink, synthetic and natural polymers such as gelatin and collagen. Another interesting development is 4D printing, similar to 3D printing, but the resulting 3D shape is able to morph into different forms in response to environmental stimulus, with a fourth dimension being time, creating a programmable matter. Currently, 3D printing accounts for less than 1% of global manufacture, but is predicted to keep growing, now doubling each 3 years, possibly in the future accounting for tens of percent of global manufacture. Now most research and development laboratories, universities, even libraries and high schools have 3D printers, and a person can buy a 3D printer for just hundreds of dollars and download millions of designs from the internet. However, it's unlikely that 3D printing will soon displace traditional manufacturing methods and will continue to be used mainly for rapid prototyping, highly configurable parts such as surgical implants, and small production runs. Also, the more common business model is outsourcing the printing to specialty businesses that do 3D printing, as 3D printing remains slow, expensive, and difficult. Even though many companies have a 3D printer, to meet their printing demands might require various machines, making it cheaper, quicker, and more efficient to outsource to a company that specializes in 3D printing. I broke from my regular essays on cognitive science due to the additive manufacturer conference this week and hope to return in the next weeks to cognitive science. However, I have been following 3D printing technology now for a decade and believe it is one of the great emerging technologies of the 21st century. Another triumph. How many views do we have on this one so far?
It should say at the top of it. I just closed it out.
Oh, that's right. So you're happy with
45.
this for now? You're happy with this one for now, or what?
I mean, at 45 in just a few hours. So my
Yeah,
one on
but I
cognitive
mean, you
dissonance.
can't make edits, right? That's one of the weaknesses is that you can't make edits. And this is somehow sort of built into your chess server. Like, could you tell us about your like chess.org a little bit?
Yeah, I put off topic. So I'm using the chess server because it has a better blog than Twitter. So Twitter, you can't make corrections or edits. I put it also on my Twitter review is the Twitter blog site that you could use just with your Twitter account. But you can't make edits, and I wasn't getting as many hits, and it's more difficult to like embed pictures and stuff like that. So, and I actually donate money to the chess server. You see the wings next to the Doovid name. It's because I'm a donor.
Oh,
So
congratulations. So you can, in fact, make edits on this one.
yeah, so that's why I'm using the chess server because
And they don't mind because it's basically looks like there's a section for community blogs. So you're basically welcome to do that.
yeah, and I mean a lot of my blogs um, had to do with the first one on memory techniques and even cognitive dissonance, and the last one on Kotov was specifically on chess. And I actually have, I mean, I have over 2,000 followers on YouTube, but next to that, I have like 600 friends on Facebook, um, and I probably have like over 500 followers on the chess server. So, the Facebook used to allow you to have notes or blog, and they got rid of it. But YouTube doesn't have a blog like that. So, the chess server, I have quite a few followers. I'm writing about things related to chess, and I'm a donor. I donate like $100 a year to the chess server and a coach. So whatever reason, it made the most sense to host my blog on Lee Chess. And it's actually a French server, Lee Chess, based out of France.
Nice. Well, everyone check that out. If you're interested, give it a click because Doovid is more likely to write if there are more viewers.
Yeah, I didn't get that much of a good response at review, although like I was going to do it and keep on
It's a
posting them.
niche field. I mean, it's art.
Well, I mean, thank God I put like I got
It's
good
like
response
doubly
on.
niche because it's like art and tech, two niche fields. But go ahead.
Well, I was saying I only, I had almost 100 views on the first essay, but like no, I'm down to like tens of views on my Twitter, like so only
As
20 or
compared to
so.
what though? The cognitive dissonance one?
All of my essays saying on Twitter, I hardly got any views. So I've been getting much more
Oh,
views
okay.
on the chess server than on Twitter. So I have like 400 followers on Twitter. They're maybe mostly bots or trolls or whatever. So of the people who watch Week in Review who actually looked at the site were only tens of people, and so I'm not probably are chess players because I'm a pretty good chess player, and I'm usually on the leaderboard. There's millions of people on the chess server, and it's competitive, and I'm usually on the leaderboard on the variants. So it's probably it's been a good place for my blog and garner some attention because maybe people want to beat me at chess or take me more seriously because I'm on the leaderboard on the chess server to take what I say more seriously.
What's your ranking?
Um, well, there's different variants. So, I mean, at regular chess, like I'm in the tens of thousands. There's millions of people who play, but the leaderboard includes variants. So I'm in the top 100 at 3 different variants, the top 10 currently in one of them, and the top 25 at another. And they have weekly tournaments, and if you win the weekly or monthly tournament, um, it'll put you on the leaderboard. And I've basically been consistently on the leaderboard for like the last year. So if like the all the variants in the leaderboard maybe list about 40 names, and of the weekly, monthly, and daily tournaments, and I'm pretty consistently on that. So of the millions of people on the chess server, if they check the leaderboard, they'll see my name, Doovid. Plus, I'm a coach. I'm a head of an Israeli chess team that has over 100 members, and a variant chess team where I'm co-captain with the current world champion of this variant, where I'm currently ranked 10th in the world, and my co-captain is currently the best in the world, and that is over 400 members. So I think that the chess garners people to be more interested in what I have to say because it's a appeal to expertise, and if you're a chess player, you're more likely to appeal towards chess expertise. So that's and I actually have on my YouTube my chess profile linked on my YouTube, like the little icon. If you check Doovid's YouTube, and they have little icons. I think of like my Twitter, Discord, um, maybe if in Facebook and my chess server linked. So I'll probably continue. Maybe event. I had paid for the Doovid.com. It was like $10 a year, and I let it expire. Maybe at some point I'll buy my own web page. I'm not sure if like I at this point, the chess server, I'm on it regularly. I'm getting good, reasonably good viewership, and anyone could, link to the chess server from any server to read the blog. So I'll probably just continue. I'll put it on Review and Twitter, even though it's not really growing, and I'll just use the chess server. And if I, grow or decide to put more into it, I'll probably make my own webpage like Doovid.com.
Nice. Well, that'll be interesting to watch and see what happens and how that progresses. So good job on that. So have you decided what's going to happen? What you're writing on next week, or?
No, I don't know. Um, I had thought to write on critical theory in the Frankfurt School. Like, God forbid, I mentioned that in national news, God forbid, about my high school and that Obama uh, high school biology class. But like the high school I went to was founded on uh, the critical theory in the Frankfurt School. Some of the teachers even were direct students of the founders of the critical school, um, and it's a pretty important issue. So I thought maybe I'd write an essay. I downloaded a few books, um, so maybe I'll write an essay next week on critical theory. If not, um, I want to do in the next few weeks an overview of the science of expertise. How do we define and understand expertise, and like the transfer of expertise, and either critical theory or the science of expertise. And it takes a lot of work, so I might have to do it to every 2 weeks, because it really takes like tens of hours of work to just write a few page essay, at least for the caliber essay I'm trying to write. And the writing only takes an hour, 2 or 3 hours, um, but the research takes tens of hours. So even like critical theory, if I'm going to read 2 or 3
Well, do
books
you
on.
ever read summaries as research? Like instead of trying to actually read articles, you just go and read a summary.
Well, I don't think I would have wrote a good essay. The because I went to the 3D printing conference this week, I had a whole bunch of reading material that I picked up at the conference, and I actually read 5 whole books on 3D printing this week. Like 400-page books. So I read like actually thousands of pages this week on 3D printing, and even the week
Yeah.
before on Kotov, and I also read uh, multiple books. So these essays I wrote the last few weeks, I read multiple books, full length books, to write the essay, and proper preparation prevents poor performance. It's mostly in the research. So I could probably pop out an essay, and especially that I'm doing these historical analysis, that takes a lot of work. And like last week I was doing Kotov, and I could have just pounded out probably in a few hours. Like the one last week on candidate moves and decision trees, I could have just explained the chess aspect of it in a few hours, but I decided to do, um, for a short essay, is a mildly comprehensive history of decision making and analysis trees. And so I actually had to read like a number of full books on it, and it took me a few hours. And like memory, when I did on memory, I read like 2 or 3 books on the history of memory. And the main reason it's taking so long is because I like including these historical analysis. In the historical analysis really only takes 1 page, so from that aspect, um, but I enjoy the research, and so I guess the writing's an incentive to do the research. Like for expertise also, I've read enough books on it I have to review, but if I thought about like a full historical analysis on expertise, I haven't even searched for it. So like the critical theory, I already have the books ready. I already
I
got
hope
the
you
book.
don't, because you're gonna disappear in a library and won't see you for another 400 years.
Well, I get to order the books and just read from my house, but so I'd have to search. Like, so I know I have books on expertise. I've already read a lot and know a lot about it, and articles. But there's probably books on the history of expertise, and so if I wanted to do a thorough analysis on the history of expertise, I would probably get 2 or 3 books on the subject and read through those. And they're talking like 1,000 pages. Even Doovid's a speed reader. It could be a good 5-10 hours in articles. And so my method, first the research, then I'll start writing out a timeline and definitions, for my like flow chart of the essay. I'll start by writing the main definitions and a timeline, and then from there, at some point, I'll start writing like introductory paragraph, and hopefully my thoughts will be together. And then so usually I have a paragraph definitions, a paragraph or a few on the history, and then try to have some sort of comprehensive frame of the essay, like why I'm writing, why it's important, explaining the topic, a historical overview, maybe connecting it to the topics at hand or current events, or why it will be important for me and my research, or people who follow my research in the future. So that's the current trend of my essays. um, then the thought to actually put it into a book on multiple truth hypothesis. So 3D printing won't be included in my book on the multiple truth hypothesis, although it's remotely related, just technological advancements. But like, no, I don't think 3D printing will be included in my book on the
Well, I
multiple
think
truth.
what you could do is you write persuasive essays and say, okay, have a look at this essay. It's better than anything anyone ever did. And it took me 1 week. And there's an anecdote that my thing is awesome. It's not a proof, but it's something. And then you sort of, I'm obviously like, that's way more like, but persuasive essay writing down the line, once the book is done, this could be something you sort of point to as an anecdote.
Well, I'm just generic science writing. So like I said, I sent my essay to Professor to Abby from the Science of Consciousness, and maybe she showed Professor Hamrov, and he wrote his essay, and it included like a little historical analysis. It's possible he read that Abby showed him the essay, but I mean it's not necessary. It's not, but it's remotely
Yeah.
possible that she had showed it to Professor Hamrov, and he had that kind of historical overview that he included in the article we showed the other week. But there's not much science writing. Like like there was almost no coverage of the Science of Consciousness conference. So even if you searched for like a blog on the Science of Consciousness conference, like you might get Doooovid's essay, and because the rapid manufacture, it's a big field. My YouTube video got 200 plus views. That like 3D printing nerd got over 10,000 views. Um, it took up the whole main convention center in Detroit. There was a few newspaper articles about the convention, but they didn't really do any science writing on it, like my essay that is 1,700 words and covers the history and the basics of the technology. So like the local Detroit papers just had like there's a printing conference, and it was a very small, maybe a picture or like a highlight story of someone local in the business field. So I don't think science writing is conducive to persuasive essay. That it's more just the facts, and I'm trying to keep it just the facts style. But it's also Doovid and Doovid's blog. So to people who read regularly, to follow kind of my direction of thought and research. But I'm more dry, just the facts, scientific, and if it's persuasive, it's only mildly persuasive, and like why this is important in the direction of technology. And even that, like I'm not trying to sell 3D printing. And
But
I
you're
think,
trying to sell your book in the future. I'm not saying this is a project for now. I'm saying it's a longer term goal. And if you think about a longer term goal, even if it's not happening right away, it helps it be better when it happens, maybe.
yeah, my style is more dry and just the facts. So
But
if
you
it
may
persuades,
decide that you want to branch into slightly alternative topics to make yourself a better writer. I'm not saying persuasive in the sense of go out on a ledge with a skull in your hand and start reciting, Shakespearean poetry, but
no, I mean, I'm not like Charles Moskowitz. Not my style. I'm not trying
that's
to
not what I was
get
suggesting.
people to.
Never mind then.
I'm not trying to get people to change their opinions, or to teach them how to think. More and
I meant
explain their.
as an argument that MTH is a good way to, it's a good memory technique.
Yeah, but I wouldn't sell it or persuade. Like I would just explain it, and
Okay.
so that wouldn't be my style at all. Like I wouldn't try to persuade. I would just explain it. I'm not a salesman like that.
Or you're not a salesman like that.
I would just explain it. And like, so the chess server is probably why I'm getting a bunch of hits. So people see me on the leaderboard, and they're like, oh, what's this guy's secret? And they might want to know my secret. For like generic, you might have to, try to sell it. Why is this interesting? Why should you care? And I'm kind of like, well, it's not interesting. You probably don't care. And so like, I'm not a seller like that. And there's very little money, even if even if like some sort of periodical uh, paid me, like TCT, like the Rapid TCT Conference. TCT is a magazine on 3D printing. There's technical magazines. Even if they printed my article and they paid me, like it would probably be just a small few $100s. So like if a technical magazine like wanted to print that essay, um, I would probably only get paid a few $100s. So it's more an intellectual exercise, and I guess I'm an elitist like that, where I'm just like, you're not going to understand this. I'm not going to persuade you to try to understand it. It's
What
unlikely you're
about
going to.
just for yourself to say it's done?
Well, I'm saying I'm explaining complicated concepts that are generally beyond the grasp of most people, and they're also things that your average person doesn't care about, wouldn't find any interest in, and so that's fine. It's a niche field, and it's only conducive to science geeks or intellectuals. Carl, shalom, Rune, blessings. Good to see you. I actually abhor, like I don't sell stuff like I don't even have a distaste of that style. I would rather like that's why I didn't want to write in the first place. So I'm glad it's picked up at least on the chess server. I'm getting some viewership, and I said that's so we'll see if there's any. I didn't have comments enabled. I didn't see the that the server had something, so I didn't don't no one has left any comments on the chess server. So this week I have comments enabled, and I enabled comments on all the other previous blogs on the chess server. We'll see if anyone leaves any comments. Even like Ninja 3D Ninja Nerd. I hate those stupid jokes. Even like Jennifer, I hate her stupid jokes. Like I've never laughed at one of them. Um, so it's not my style. You'll never see me doing that.
So persuasive essay is of the same class of things as laughing at jokes for you?
Yeah, to me, it's just bad character. You might be able to give
Okay.
some other argument, but like
Well, I mean, I don't want to disagree with your personal opinion. I could offer my different, what amounts to personal opinion, but wouldn't be with the goal of trying to like diminish what you're saying.
yeah, no, it's not. It's not my style. It's not going to happen. Like I'm a grown man. That's not me. Like nagging me to write was a good thing. I'm writing. Like nagging me to change my style is not going to happen.
George says, "What about wearing a mask?" Not sure what the context is on that one, bud.
I guess in my video, if someone saw my video and someone even unfollowed me, they were like, "I saw the mask and I unfollowed you." Um,
Yikes.
Masks are no longer required. I guess I'm more better safe than sorry. My mother, my parents are elderly. I care for my mother, and even though she's now had 4 shots, she's quadruple vaccinated. Um, like I figure better safe for sorry, and I don't want to put my mother at risk. Right now, COVID numbers are pretty high. Actually, here in Michigan, there are over 4,000 cases. The hospitalization and death count has not picked up, so it's unclear whether. I guess it's already another wave at this point. Like the COVID numbers, there's already over 100,000 cases a day in America. Michigan's one of the worst states in the country again. So there's already another wave of COVID currently right now. So I'm wearing my mask. I mentioned that at the beginning of my video that it's the CDC recommendation. However, at this point, most people aren't following it. Most people are vaccinated, and God forbid, deaths. There was almost as many deaths in the last wave as in any other previous wave. So it's very possible, God forbid, that the current wave that's just starting right now, hospitalizations and deaths will follow again. So I'm masking up, but I'm libertarian in that. So it doesn't bother me that other people aren't masked up as long as they allow me to social distance and like aren't in my face.
Strange.
And most of my streams are I'm not. It's not me. Like so, just a few seconds where I'm talking. But 90% of the stream doesn't have me. It's like you're looking at what I'm filming, what I'm seeing, as opposed to me myself. So like I'm not. Well, you have any thoughts on 3D printers? I said I'm really bad at sales. I even mentioned to Gandalf, who like, I guess congratulations to getting engaged, if he's might be getting engaged. He'd pop on Week in Review. He'd bring his fiance onto Week in Review if he wants. But like I'd mentioned to him that you could capitalize economically on intelligence as a salesman for industrial machinery. And I guess Aiken uh, hasn't appeared to watch or been in the chat, the last few months, but used to, tune in regularly and deal with technical stuff. But 3D printers are expensive. Like you could buy not like a MakerBot or like a 3D system, a desktop one, but industrial 3D printers cost tens, hundreds of thousands of dollars, and the sales commission would probably be a few percent. That you could make hundreds or thousands of dollars, even possibly tens of thousands of dollars if you sold, a few or some of the more expensive 3D printer models, and also 3D scanners. And so, at a point where I was really looking for employment, I considered it's hard, like a lot of employments are sales and commission. I'd considered um, applying. I even went to training this place called CamLogic uh, for their 3D printers, and it's the type thing where it's more technical than persuasion. And at the time, 3D printers were really cool, useful technology, and somewhat easy to sell because just like this technology is awesome, it's useful. You could do things that you want to do with them, and so it wouldn't be so much persuasion. It would be more explaining and understanding how the technology works to explain it to a person, and then like the setup and maintenance of teaching the person how to use the machine, or some sort of service contract. But I didn't end up being a 3D printer salesman. Industrial equipment in general, not just 3D printers. That was the only one I found really cool and interesting that I would have considered being a salesman. But any sort of industrial equipment sales, um, gyrometers. I had a friend who used to come to the chess club who was a gyrometer, a gyrometer salesman, for automotive industry. But there's tons of, here in Metro Detroit, large, complicated industrial equipment that you could make a good living selling and getting a few percent commission, similar to like a real estate broker. And like real estate brokerage, like I'd also briefly consider, but it's unlikely because I'm so bad at and non-personable, or dislike of sales, personality, persuasion, that it would be a real estate broker. The only thing I considered was industrial sales. And like I said, industrial sales is one of the fields where you could make a large amount of money having a high IQ, where it's like real estate isn't that complicated, it's more personality. Industrial sales, things are complicated. Most people can't understand this stuff. So even 3D printers, um, your average person just isn't going to be able to understand it, would not be qualified to be a salesman for the technology because it requires a certain amount of scientific, technical know-how, mathematics, specifications. Um, that's one of the fields that if you could understand complicated, expensive equipment and sell it, you could make large sums of money.
I'm reminded of I might just resize this image a little bit. Someone asked a question. It was a good one earlier, and I forgot exactly what it was. Something about most of these machines taking a certain type of material, like something basically with a fairly low melting point that basically works for rapid prototyping. And I was thinking, like, what actually is going to be taken over by these things is every domain that is optimized for utility via rapid prototyping, theoretically.
Yeah, I have whole books, and like this point, that's why I said why most places outsource their printing, because different printing demands require different printers and the different materials. So, like a simple plastic that just has different colors and a level of um, fine details. Like if it prints in a layer is like microns, thousandths of a millimeter or something like that. Uh, they'll have the specifications and the material, or if it's laser sintering in a powder bed, how fine the powder is, and how fine the detail is, and that's why it's so slow. If a laser is like a thousandth of an inch, and it takes like a few seconds to do a layer, that be minutes for or hours or whatever. So printing takes a long period of time. But at this point, there's thousands of different types of material, and for laser sintering and powder beds, um, you could use a wide variety of materials, and there's a whole section of the business. So the conference, there were material providers, and then it's in the material science of the nature of the material with the machine, and then obviously machines have certain materials. Some of the if it's plastic spools, a lot of the companies will have a sister company that makes the plastic spool that's fed into the computer. Um, but yeah, so it goes hand in hand, the materials, and that's one of the reason why outsourcing. So like even if you're like Ford Motor Company, and so if you have your research and development laboratory and you want to make a prototype, um, and you're just going to make a plastic part, you might have one or a few 3D printers in your research and development. But if you need to make pieces that might be to actually go in a component, and it was said like low runs, where you're only going to make tens or hundreds of a piece, or you only need one specific piece, that you would use it. Um, the printer that you have may not work with that material. So if there's an outsourced 3D printing company, they might have tens of machines, and they have a variety of machines that work better for different materials. For example, copper is extremely difficult to print. There's some methods to print copper. Um, you could also print like circuit boards
My
and
guess is with copper, they're mostly printing molds
printing
and then
what?
just taking molten copper and dropping them into molds. Correct me if I'm wrong there.
No, they use the laser sintering method. So they'll be like there'll be a powder bed that has a whole bunch of like fine metal filaments that are like microns big, and when two lasers hit, it causes them to fuse together. So, and it'll be layer by layer. So there would be a whole bunch of powder of if it's copper, copper is difficult because I guess it's electrically conductive. But if it if it was titanium or something like that, there would be very fine titanium powder, and it might be alloyed with certain things for material science reasons. Two lasers would hit, fine tune, like micron uh, lasers would hit the powder, causing it to fuse. And then once the whole XY plane of a layer had been finished, usually there's a platform that lowers, and then they would do another laser sintering on the next layer. And but the so uh, the extrusion process is usually only used for plastic. Most metal printing is done through powder laser sintering that has two lasers. That one laser is not enough to join the particles. You need two lasers shined upon it, and they do have metal extruders, but as I said, in that MakerBot thing I showed at the beginning, it takes a temperature of like 1300 degrees Celsius. So it's not practical to have, like molten metal inside a printer. And that's why they use the laser sintering, where you have two very fine beam lasers that hit uh, powdered metal and cause it to fuse.
Thanks very much. And maybe there's a misunderstanding. You can correct, just going from Bob Elvis's question. It'd be nice if they can invent 3D mold making machine that can mold from 3D files. Well, that's essentially what they are. So there is a gap there, but the question is understanding the nature of the gap, right? So most of what these things are is rapid prototyping facing, polymer printing, relatively rapid. Like obviously this can take days if it's a large model, but you're not getting hyper fine. Like basically that can give you a certain resolution. So if you don't need ultra fine resolution, that's fine. That's already there. But if you need to go ultra resolution, that's where there's a jump in complexity of the tech, which is what Doovovid is attempting to give a sort of summary of. It's hard to do because it's very much an evolving technology. And we don't really know what it means for 1% to be like if we're going to accept that the tipping point thing is a basic operating principle, like the Pareto principle, well, we don't know how close we are to that, but we can try to estimate it. And that sort of comes from multi things. And who knows how much penetration on the market there will be in this, but it's an interesting, would you even say scientific prediction or what? Prediction of your model?
Say again?
I was saying the prediction, it's a prediction of your model that this is going to have a larger market share imminently. Or isn't it? I guess I'm asking if your model somehow makes predictions with regards to printers, 3D printers.
I don't think any prediction in saying that. I mean, you could use the multiple truth hypothesis for anything, including science, just where there's uncertainty and multiple possibilities. So even like mentioning the methods, but no, I think 3D printing is relatively straightforward, and it's an interdisciplinary subject with multiple facets combining together. That the multiple truth hypothesis would largely be inapplicable. So I don't have any special model. It was basically pure scientific reporting.
Okay. Yeah, there was a question. I mean, there was I don't know if you want to go back to this transhumanism thing, but talking about computer having emotions and what it means and so on and so forth. Like, can a computer have emotions? I don't know if you have an opinion on that, or if you think that's a stupid question to even ask. I guess so. Nothing. Yeah. So generally, closing remarks on this 3D printer thing. It's interesting to see the bottleneck happen in real time, because it's sort of the same thing with internet design. Who's actually working on the level of building the internet? It evolves over time, and it's really cool to watch this evolve, because like, who knows how good it's going to be and in how much time. So anyway, great reporting there. So that was good.
Yeah, I'd recommend that to Gandalf hanging out at. I mean, it's remotely possible. I signed up, so this week I'm going to the plastic mold injection conference, and I don't think that's interesting enough to write about it. Although maybe, I mean, like, because that's one of the main engineering methods, and like I'll probably go and do a stream, but I doubt I'm going to write an essay on the plastic mold injection thing. And I've never went to that conference before. And say 3D printing, I've been following for like 10 years, and I've went to training seminars, and I've seen private um, demonstrations of latest technology. Even have friends that are involved in the business. Plastic mold injection. I'm going to go to the conference. The week after is an automation conference. Maybe I'll write on that. Like if I'm writing just to keep myself in the habit of writing, it's a lot of work, for no reward. Maybe just personally intellectual. So at least like writing on cognitive science, I feel like okay, I'm going to try to write a book or forward my own research, as opposed to just you're reporting on something that no one cares about really. Although I did get so the steel conference I only got 50 views. The 3D printing conference, I got over 200 views. I might even get, continue to get hundreds of views. I doubt the 3D. I mean, I doubt the plastic mold injection will get that many views. Although, it's like the foam show. I'll probably go to the foam show again and stream from the foam show. Um, but yeah, I mean, it's good. It's good. It's important for Detroit and America and economics. It's unlikely it's going to economically improve my situation. It's remotely possible that someone from the show or will pick up and be like, "Oh, great essay," and want to include it in some sort of periodical. Plastic mold injection. I'm not, I'm like, don't plan on writing on that. The following week or the week after is the automotion robotics. So I've also been following robotics, going to automation shows for years, and I've thought about industrial contracting, construction of industrial floors. Um, so maybe I'll try to write an essay on automation, and I would probably do the same style where I do like a historical analysis of robotics and automation. Um, but yeah, it's not connected really to. I could connect anything to multiple truth hypothesis because it's generically useful, but it's not really connected to it. It's just, but it's connected to me because I've been going to these engineering shows, for a decade now. I'm a civil engineer, and unfortunately, I wanted to be involved in construction and like really, I wanted to be involved in making religious institutes and like places of worship, but professionally, I would like to be involved in like design of factories and industrial things, but it's complicated. You have to work full time, and these jobs where I'd have to dedicate my whole life to it. Then I never got employment in the field. Um, but it's part of me. I've been doing these conferences for years. I'm educated as a civil engineer, and so it's possible that I'll continue writing essays on engineering topics, but I mean they're pretty dry. 3D printing is about as interesting from the engineering field as you're going to get. Um, Automation maybe also is somewhat, but not even because 3D printing is like groundbreaking, and you could get like your own desktop 3D printer, and it's intuitive, where people could understand. Robotics also, you could buy like a I forget the name of the company, like a $10,000 robot that you could personally train. That like an arm where you could move. Like there's self training where you move the um, the robot arms, and then it will do a repetitive motion. You don't have to program it. Um, but those are also expensive, like 10,000 plus dollars, and they're not that common. But so automation might also be somewhat interesting that people would look at. And sometimes the conference they have cool displays and robotics and stuff like that. So we'll see. Writing's time consuming. It's good intellectually. For professionally, I didn't get my master's degree. I didn't continue educationally, but that's the type thing they make you do in school. So, saying like, this history stuff, if you took a class on 3D printing and, they made you write an essay or something like that. So that's one of the positive things that, like continuing adult education that, um, like we can review continuing adult education.
Yeah, I guess be nice if you could find like a pace to keep doing it at like just keep going with it. One a week might be a lot, but who knows? I guess it's kind of a value proposition thing. So I'll have to see where it goes and trim the sails as the trip advances. So yeah, I didn't fully go over all my stuff, but I feel like it's gonna bore you because it's like super technical. I was working with this guy that this was a thing I was like really happy about that I was saying that we originally like we really weren't getting along very well, and then we sort of got along better. Like we overcame our like our I don't want to say our hate or hatred because I don't really feel like I hate anybody. Ah, I like to resolve conflict, not create it. But anyway, like there was definitely tension between us, and it happens. But we got over it, so I was super happy. And just really interested in music, and I'm just, as we all know, terrible at music, and I own it.
Yeah, Rune's saying here just quit. Like my engineering skills are very impressive. Could we talk about mathematics a lot? And engineering is applied mathematics, and even him being a quick head to understand, engineering is the practical application of science. So something like 3D printing, um, even Jennifer, has a degree in physics. Something like laser sintering, and if I were better, I would give numbers. So if it's talking about degrees or something like there's a powder and there's two lasers and their magnitude or whatever that causes these things. But yeah, it's the power of science to understand technology and and Jennifer's not an engineer, but with a background in physics, presumably would be unable to understand how these various technologies work.
Yes, when it comes to engineering things, I haven't a clue. Haven't a clue.
But it's just the application of physics. Maybe it's just like consciousness. I mean, because we are talking, we could go back if you want to talk about Philip Goff and um,
Yeah, yeah,
the
I do a
the
lot. Definitely glad you didn't. I'm glad you reminded
the
me
word
because
slipping my
absolutely.
name now, but um, the emergence, the strong emergence, but saying that if consciousness arises from the brain in physics, that you say, okay, well, consciousness is historically from the field of theology and philosophy. But if you want to explain it as a physical mechanism, rising from the brain, electricity, or even something you will call esoteric, like information theory, computer programming. Information theory is not quite the same as physics, uh, and even how you imply what you call information
Frankly,
theory.
different domains define the term information differently, and it doesn't have an absolute definition. It's a bit like intelligence, have an absolute definition, but there
I went
doesn't.
on the beginning active interference. I'm talking about Markov blankets and um, uh, Bayesian analysis. That if that gives a rise to consciousness, that's applied physics. It's engineering, and so the philosophy. You have some philosophical training to understand empiricism, the science of the philosophy of science, but consciousness, the science of consciousness, and at the end of the day, it's hardcore science. It's like the hammer of Penrose. It's
It's
extremely
integral
complicated
metaphysics. It's
quantum
just
mechanics. You're
subjective.
talking about the orchestrated objective reduction, and relatively the um, objective reduction of the wave equation is graduate level physics. And yeah, so it's similar to consciousness. And if you could 3D printing relatively is much more simple than consciousness. Although,
Absolutely, because what's happening is
it's
uncontroversial.
not simple though. I mean, 3D
No one
printing
is
started,
no
it also
there are
requires.
absolutely difficult aspects of it, but no one is disagreeing as to what the utility of the 3D printer is anytime they're invoking it. It's like the dentist has every idea what he intends to do with that. It's text for him. Whereas with consciousness, it's not the same thing because you're discussing it, something you're experiencing. So there's a level of interference of the subject that doesn't apply to something like the 3D printers. So like science doesn't really apply to consciousness right now. It could, but I don't think it really does at present. We have theories that, like Skyworks is saying, Philip Goff is incorrect. Like, I don't want to say the theories are unfalsifiable. Like, I wouldn't go that far, but there is an issue with validation of these consciousness theories because the level of self-reference is more self-evident in consciousness than in a, calibrating a machine.
In Rune, if you're going to Malta, enjoy, the good karmatic vibrations of chanting Hare Krishna is always a good thing to do no matter where you go. If you want to explain your new diagram, sorry, I just want to address some of the comments in the chat before we moved on to your awesome new picture diagrams.
Oh yeah, I'm. I understand. I like going in circles a lot, clearly, and it's just really great to be able to share these experiences with people. And I don't really get music, but it's like doing all these highly mathematical music, but they're also musical. So it sort of reminds me of my student from back in the day. He was like a physics major, so he could play by ear. That always was just like, damn, how can he do that? Be at parties, like, whoa. So there was a question about whether AI is going to be dysgenic or eugenic. Okay. You're doing the whole chasing, like, all these devices, if they don't actually give you any insight, they're kind of pointless. So there are truths that can be revealed through the computer. But to go and infer stuff that has no reason, no basis to be inferred exists on that level is, I don't want to say magical thinking, but accept that, I accept that not everybody accepts panpsychism. I don't take that personally. Hopefully others will see the virtue in that. But things happen due to intention, okay? If there's an intention for something to happen, it happens. But if there's no intention to prevent something that is predictably part of human vices, that'll happen. And I forget which book it was, but they're talking about what's subsidized. You get more of what's subsidized. And so you can have a quick pass and say, okay, well, whatever's funded by the government, you're going to get more of that. And then it's a question of like, well, what does it actually mean for something to be subsidized? You can have more nuanced conversations, but you got to be able to get on the same page somehow, which is the whole power of the physics thing. The idea with physics is that there's a pre-existing, which we now know was a mirage, right? But it has, like, the mirage matters. What people believe about physics matters. The fact that we can have arguments about physics is good, but it doesn't change the fact that there will remain this rigid absolutist thinking with regards to science, even if it's completely bubblified, as would appear to be the case in this diagram, which I keep going back to this website to generate these hyperbolic tilings. And it's great. And to me, this is part of what makes technology great. I also love to go on the text to image AI because I feel like I can use my creativity. And that's what, if we're going to become integrated in machines, which if people are worried about quote unquote dysgenic transhumanism, you know, worry about the effects of proximity to these machines for long periods of time and what effect that has on your overall state of mind, and maybe using them for more virtuous things that improve the state of mind, like holistic thinking. Anyway, hyperbolic tiling is awesome. So it kind of to me is like taking a vacation almost as another person, as much as that's possible. Hashtag not crazy, but like, what do you think it was like to be MC Escher? Excuse me. Because he did, MC Escher, right? Do you enjoy his, are you an MC Escher enjoyer?
Yeah, I think I even own a book of his artwork, and obviously I have Hofstadter's Gödel Bach. I'm not like, I coach chess at the Detroit Institute of Arts, and my parents are art fans. I have books on arts, but yeah, I leaning towards Escher with mathematical leanings, and my father's. I remember as a young child, maybe even pre-teenage years, reading or trying to read Gödel Escher Bach because my father had that book on his shelf, and like I'd seen like, oh, Escher, I like those pictures, so I even read as a young child, or tried to read to the best of my understanding, Hofstadter's Gödel Escher Bach.
Yeah. So,
I was just reading also, I forget which history of science publication, um, that Escher, who is contemporary, like in the Royal Society. So I'm trying. Maybe I'll look that up. But I was reading about some other scientific um, name, and he had met with Escher. So Escher was in the Netherlands. He only died in 1972. So I mean, it was probably physics. Maybe it was Gödel himself. So I forget who I was reading about, and what contemporaries. But like he had met with mathematicians and known um, some of the major names, and even his ideas in painting. It's slipping my mind right now where his name came up in my recent research.
you mean hyperbolic tilings having something to do with 3D printers?
No, not this week. Maybe it was Roger Penrose. Even on Wikipedia, it says. So I mean, maybe he knew Penrose. I mean, he died in 1972, but no, it was a few weeks ago. I was doing research, and I was reading a book on something, and it mentioned Escher in terms like one of these mathematicians or scientists uh, had met and was friends with Escher. Like the expertise.
Oh, okay. It's
Experts get together, and like
come
I
back to
mean, it
me.
wasn't Einstein or something, but there was some big name in the science like used to hang out with Escher, and they used to discuss things.
Yeah, I mean, I forget the name, but it's I remember now we talked about it. So memes asked, aside from panpsychist definition, does consciousness means medically influenceable? It's not. It's that's like saying that the number of uh, electrons in an atom is something we have control over. Do we?
The what?
Well, memes is asking, like, there's just it's back to the panpsychism thing being very challenging as a knowledge discovery device or fundamental belief or axiom or whatnot, because it creates cognitive dissonance with subjectivity itself. So I would suggest just put aside whatever it feels like it's saying, whatever it seems like panpsychism means, it's not that. It's literally a definition that is the full meaning of it doesn't matter. The full meaning is that it was designed by me to be consistent with math that already existed or that almost already existed. It was easy enough for me to brute force into existing. So everything has conscious because everything undergoes waveform reduction, but the complexity of a waveform reduction is different. So it's not particularly informationally dense to say that an individual electron undergoes waveform reduction. That's just saying that, oh, it goes through a slit, then it's going to have a delta in the distribution, but still a high degree of regularity in the distribution of its outcome.
I was joking in the chat during the conference that there's conscious and conscious, and
Are you
conscious.
saying conscience or like what is the distinction? Sorry,
Well, they're spelled different. So we talk like science of consciousness. It's CONSCIOUS, as
because I'm
opposed
thinking
to.
of several different words. I'm thinking of conscient, conscious, uh, and then there's another one of like.
I forget. Someone mentioned um, Elie Wiesel at the Science of Conscious conferences, and I put in the chat. Elie Wiesel was referred to as the consciousness of America or something, like the consciousness of humanity, and that's CONSCIENC, and that refers to morality. So ironically, conscience, like consciousness, in terms like he doesn't have a conscience. I mean, like he doesn't
It's conscience.
differentiate.
Yeah, that's what it is. It's
He
a different
doesn't
word.
differentiate
Conscience, that's like a
between.
guilt thing. Like feeling
Well,
like your conscience is supposedly like it's a part of your ego, or it's understood that way as like the thing that makes you feel bad about doing something bad.
but
That's not the same as
ironically, that
conscious.
literally means with science. So conscious, referring to like morality, which should be ascientifically, is literally conscience with science, as opposed to, and also like consciousness is also the same root, like the SCIOUS of science knowledge. But like, so
Okay, looks like we're okay. The music is still playing, so just give me a second there. And okay, I apologize for that. All right, we'll go back to here. Okay. Sorry about the interruption. We really didn't lose that much. I just had to restart the window there. Okay.
the memes put in the chat that he said Penrose's father met with Escher. I don't think that's what I was reading. I think even it was a bigger name than even Penrose. I mean, Penrose is a pretty big name, but like Escher was, connected in circles, and he knew a little bit about mathematics, and hung out in circles with some well-known people. Um, but yeah, I put there in the chat, conscious and conscious. They're pronounced the same, even though there's one spelled IOU and one spelled IE.
Well, that's the thing. They're not the same thing. One is, you're not always feeling your conscience when you're conscious. So they
Well, they are
are,
the same. I'm saying there's the etymology and then there's the current
they may
usage.
have had the same etymology at some point, but the meaning is not the same.
Well, I'm saying that the meanings are relative. So the current
Well, in what
usage.
context?
Well, I was making the point that what you're talking about, like everything of consciousness, is largely useless because you need a precise definition of consciousness for that statement to mean anything. Like
And that's
panpsychism,
precluded by language, or
pan consciousness. You need to give a precise definition of the word conscious for that statement to mean anything.
no, you can refer to shared meaning.
Yeah, but so if you think like, well, what is consciousness, or if a colloquial understanding and the word conscious, IENCE, is more common and frequently used than conscious, uh, IOUS. And because the concept, like more colloquial, like don't you have a conscience? Does that bother your conscience? Uh,
Yeah, but
has
the
much
word is
more usage
conscience.
than
The word is
the
not
this.
conscious, it's conscience. When you say, doesn't that bother your conscience? A conscience is a noun, conscious is an adjective and a noun, I suppose, but conscience is uniquely a noun.
Um,
Yeah, so these
I don't think
are
there's any.
definitely interesting questions, though. I like this question a lot, but like the thing is, like, these problems exist in every field, and when we go into consciousness studies, it just makes it more obvious that that's a problem. So it's like, where do we go from that? Well, we just realize that we need models, that we're not going to necessarily know what's going on under the hood with any of these models. And right now, what we're thinking is understanding is just familiarity and having memorized something, and that doesn't actually mean that that's optimized.
If you look up the.
What are you alluding to? God, I love these Escher pics. I especially love the one of the teacher and the student. Oh my
So
gosh.
if you look up the
Oh,
etymology, conscious, both spellings of consciousness derive from the same etymology.
well, every single word that starts with con, which means with in Latin, has the same, like, some connection. Like, so, okay, great. So there can be splits. And to say that conscience and conscious means the same is not accurate.
I'm saying that the word conscious, even though it's spelled SAICUS, is the same word science, knowledge. That's the origin of it. There's something like
Right.
kind of like the privy, but it's the same root word of science. It is the word science, and how, like, historically, how the deviation to go to SCIU, but the word means with science.
Well, I
Like
was
there's
just thinking
different
surprise
words,
minimization. What a
one
great
actually spelled.
shorthand.
So I mean, when you say consciousness, you just mean with science, with knowledge. Um, it's somewhat of a meaningless statement, and even consciousness itself is hard to define.
Uh,
Um, I mean,
Well, you
really,
want the
really, there's.
definition that is convergent, right? So you want the unfalsifiable definition, and that's like waveform reduction. You want because no one's going to disagree that the brain is conscious.
Well, I'd say that's just the word that you're saying that consciousness is what the brain does.
No, just
Or
that consciousness is associated with the brain. I'm not even going that far. I'm saying consciousness, at the very least, we can agree that it's associated with the brain in a high level. Okay, everyone can agree with that because we're thinking from our brains. We're conscious. That's the starting point, is what I'm saying basically. And I'm saying also, if you want to have that apply scientifically as well, you just make it so that the definition accords with the extant doctrines, which are so
so if you
great.
say that everything is conscious, like the mainstream definition of conscious with the IOUS, even though it comes from the same root word of science means to be aware. So if you say everything is
Okay.
conscious, if you just use a synonym, you're saying everything is aware.
Yes, but that's self-referential. And the question is there any difference between awareness and consciousness that we can use to say that this is more than just purely uh, semantic? And I know I said that there's only semantic distinctions. That is still true. But then some become more process relational as you go down. You can only refer to process relations semantically if you've established shared meaning within those individual terms. Okay. That's a complete other thing that is not the subject of this current topic, but I just want to make it clear that I'm aware and it is fully consistent. Yeah, so I don't know if
And
Memes is joking in the chat or if you want to take these questions. Like sometimes I can't tell if he's joking around.
well, I mean, if you're talking strong emergence, that you're saying consciousness is an emergent property of everything, or the quantum of the uh, wave reduction, and that it's not a uniquely emergent property of the brain. It's actually an emergent property of all matter. I mean, that appears with Jennifer's position, and whether it's strongly emergent.
No, that's not my position. My position is to come up with a definition that is the minimal deviation from the existing doctrines that are minimally wrong so that I can have maximum concordance with what people already know. That was my original plan.
That's what
Um,
Hamerov wrote in his essay about Penrose. That it's not that um, the the observation causes the reduction of the waveform collapse. It's that or the it's the other way around, or to put which one actually causes which, or it's in the consciousness is the reduction of the waveform, uh, and or the collapse of the wave, uh, and so kind of flipping the typical understanding of cause and effect, and you're saying it's not a unique element of biology or the brain, it's a fundamental aspect of information theory that just happens to also function in the brain. That's why, mentioning artificial, computer intelligence versus human intelligence, and it's saying, well, there isn't really human intelligence. There's an objective scientific information theory of what we're going to call intelligence, and it happens in the human brain, but it's not unique to the human brain, and
well, there is
possibly.
a sense in which it's unique to the human brain. You could argue that human brain is sort of privileged among all life, so you could make that argument. But absolutely, from the more objective stance, you could say that consciousness certainly doesn't begin in the brain, and if you follow it down to the bottom of what its potentiality is actualizing, it is merely the cycle of matter corresponding to the existence of a dimensional limit. So there's 3 plus 1 in total, and then you have this sort of GAC-like blob inside it that oscillates, but it oscillates in a minimal amount, which is why I like this surprise minimization. I forget even what there's just so much research I'm going through that I forget who said it, but the surprise minimization model, it's good because it's conveying the notion of motion, but also the end of motion. And it's something that appears to be still has motion, and that's absolutely not any type of contradiction. But yeah, back to your question, like my initial plan was to make it so that what exists, like I don't want to flush the last 100 to 1,000 to 2,000 years of science down the toilet for no reason. And I don't think
Well,
that's
it's an
even,
anachronism. There is no 1,000 years of science. I mean, science is a new field, relatively. Like, the scientific method, uh, science arises with the scientific method, and what they did in ancient times isn't really science. in the same understanding, so that you're speaking anachronistically. You're anachronizing.
Fair enough. Yeah, so there, like, just like what you said, I want to distinguish between what's there, my understanding of what's there, and my own doctrines. So I have additional, interpretations saying, like, psychologically, this is a good way to break down consciousness in English. So that aside, my suggestion for quantum mechanics as it is, I mean, there are several mechanical suggestions I would make, like, before even making this consciousness thing, because I acknowledge it's very unintuitive to work directly with consciousness. Like, I'm not even suggesting that. And the whole point of some of these digressions is just to show that very point. But I'd first point to infinite lines being a concern, because at some point there is a finite manifestation of potentiality and materiality, finite amount of material doesn't have any concordance with an infinite line. I'd point to that. I'd say, like, why don't we try to take these infinite lines and tie the end of the positive and x-axis and to the negative end of the x-axis into a figure eight. Tie that up, sort of butterfly that, fairy type shape. Go in that direction first, with regards to interpreting and categorizing observables before even talking about an emergent model of consciousness and what that would entail. My attempts so far have proved incoherent to the extent that people aren't persuaded to them rationally. This is sort of presupposing that rational persuasion does happen, but obviously what
Yeah, but
people
there's no
believe is
persuasion in
true.
science. You got to knock it off. Like, if it's true, you just explain it. There's no persuasion involved. It's just technical. You explain it. If it works, it works. If it doesn't work,
With
it
consciousness,
doesn't work.
there's
You can't
a
persuade.
question as to whether consciousness can be explained per se. That's what I'm getting at. I respect your intention to be objective there, but when consciousness is intuitively subject oriented, objectivity is unclear what that means.
Yeah, but I mean, you got to give up on this persuasion. Like, you either get it and could explain it, or you don't get it and you're not going to be able to explain it. Like, you're not going to persuade. You're not going to be persuading anybody. If it works, it works. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. There's no persuasion.
But if understanding consciousness
There's no
requires a
but.
different ontology, there is going to be persuasion.
No, there's not going to be any persuasion. It's going to work or not.
Well, what does it mean for something to work?
Well, I mean, in terms of science, it usually means models and predictions, formulas. And if you're putting it into the realm of philosophy, it's either well-formed logic and coherent or not. I mean, there's no persuasion involved. I mean, that's even sophistry, saying, like, it's not, if you're in the mode of logos, you don't need persuasion. Persuasion is, specifically ethos and mostly pathos.
What you sound to me like you're making a persuasive argument right now, but I guess, fine.
No,
It's
it's
just
not,
an
it's not
explanation.
persuasive. It's definitional. Persuasion lies in the mode of ethos and pathos, not in logos.
Skywork says consciousness is the developing state of awareness. I mentioned less than probably 20 minutes ago that it's not clear that there's any difference in the definition of consciousness and awareness. So if we're using two terms that have the exact same definition, okay. So to say state of consciousness and state of awareness, is there any difference at all there? I'm going to go ahead and say not really, unless you want to try to say there's a difference. I'm talking to the audience, sorry. I was talking to
You're
Skywork,
clicking
not
either
you.
way.
What's that?
You're clicking either way.
Thank you. And you can tell I'm excited if I'm clicking, I guess, because I'm moving around more. Excuse me. And Meme says, not everyone is a Doovid. That is very true. Doovid is special. Who else could write that much in a week that was that good? Meme says, logic is logical. Uprooting long-held beliefs often must have an individual led there. So one thing I would say is that consciousness, if it's absolute, and we're used to only making reference to things relationally, it's going to require a learning curve to have an absolutism, because if it's necessarily an absolute quantity, i.e. it's additive over every iteration, every interferential iteration. And then it's a question of, well, what does it mean for an iteration to be interferential? Because it's pretty clear that a person looking at an experiment isn't causing the experiment to happen. I mean, they put the experiment together, but the experiment's happening, they started and then boom, it's gone. And the question is, well, where is there actually something happening on the level of the quantum system, the whole integral system, that we need to take into account in how we interpret it? Moral Outrage Prophet says, Doovid is cracking the epistemology, bro. Doovid's just trying to be helpful, and I appreciate that. It's just in the case of consciousness, like, I don't see how you cannot realize that it's going to be controversial no matter how, quote, logically, if that's even a thing, it's presented. That's just like, what's the, syllogism associated with it, with panpsychism?
No,
I
so
don't see
if
how
you're
that
talking,
changes anything.
if you're talking theology, maybe you're like persuasion and religion, but I mean, from the science of consciousness, no, I mean, there's no. It's going to be a theory that's mathematical and scientific and be tested, and it's going to work or not.
But the
And the
sages say
historical
that
realm,
understanding
even in
consciousness,
philosophy, it's not
the
really.
sages say that one can only come to an understanding of consciousness through yogic tech, basically. And
Yeah, I mean,
yogic
but you're
tech can't be
talking
written about
religion,
in books.
and so like you're trying to convert people to Hinduism or something like
No,
that.
I'm asserting what's
You-
been asserted in theology, that I'm not particularly excited about contradicting in a secular doctrine when I know the theology has been tested scientifically, quote unquote. I'm not going to do something I know won't work, basically.
Okay, anything else you want to cover this week?
I don't think I fully went over my diagrams, but
You want to keep on going? You could, go as long as you want, I guess. Or do you anything else you want to talk to me about?
I don't know how interested you are in these diagrams, because I started explaining and you cut me off and started off and back in your own direction there quite a while ago. Because I remember I was going to say something about,
Yeah, I mean, I could to address the chat, but
yeah.
so if you want to wrap up, and then I'll just listen, or you'll watch tomorrow, and unless you had something else you want to say to me.
Well, I sent you those diagrams, and I don't know, like, if you have any, I don't want to say if you have any questions about the diagrams I sent, but I'll probably blab about them some more. I don't know if you have to be here, or if you're interested enough in the actual domain to stick around to listen to me blab about them. Like, that's the part where I'm just not sure.
It'll probably be easy. I'll just listen tomorrow, so you could explain it, because it's probably easy just to explain, and then I'll listen to it tomorrow, and we can talk about it next week if
Awesome.
there's anything for me to add to it.
Sounds
Okay,
good.
so have a great week, and
You too.
take care.
You too. Thanks for joining. All right. It really feels good to hear Jen is right, because it really doesn't happen very often. And there's always this trepidation where it's like, oh, based on a past experience, eventually I'm going to have to say something that's just going to make things just, it's not going to be good. All right. So, you know, a lot of times I write stuff in response to what other people are talking about on various places where such things are alleged to be cared about. And let's see here. It was nice to like not be in a permanent fight with this person, that's for sure. Because there are some, you know, there have been times where it's like, oof, it's palpable. And there's, you know, times where there were really not very many of us talking at all. Which makes it even sort of, anyway, hard to sort of hit the, you know, the balance point. So, what, if possible, could you say what it is that I'm right about? Antisocial contract, because I know you're big into I don't want to say the abolishing of the state there, but and so I'm just trying to get this thing set up here. What does it all mean? Well, just sort of coming back to what's the point of metaphors and what I suppose just based myself. What I use metaphors for is when a direct explanation fails. And you're looking at pretty much 100% failure rate on a direct explanation to anyone who isn't really interested. And even if someone is interested, because they don't know what they're interested in, there's the same sort of, like, I don't know if it's like a reverse observer effect, but sort of comes to this question of what does it mean to agree to something? Well, and then it sort of comes back to intentionality. What do things reduce to? I was extremely happy that I got to make a semi, maybe like a page on Discord explanation about something very subtle, and it was great, just getting it down to that digestible bit. So there's a question about mushrooms. Don't really want to promote doing drugs on the show. So I'm just gonna say, like, well, you know, there's other people that go into that stuff, and you know, I do support most any type of like not underlying form of the consciousness research, but I'm not a big fan of just like microdosing. That's the microdosing fucking vibe, that's actually a thing. It's actually going to do something that doesn't make you, that's like borderline junkie. I know it's not, but it's the thinking along the lines of that. So, but at the same time, like, I don't want to tell people meditate, bro, because that's also my own experience with other people. Okay, they're not at a point where meditation like is going to actually take to the level that it would, So it's very hard. It's a minefield. Speaking of minefields, doesn't this diagram kind of look a little bit like a minefield? So what is this, right? So it's a combo of different technologies, and I was thinking how awesome it is that I didn't draw any of this. I didn't draw any of it. My art is pretty generally pretty shoddy. Not as bad as my singing, but bad. So this I think is a winner because it's like jacked to tits with some extra human image processing. And I think the integral processing, even if it's just like quasi-interpretational, like almost like it is when people are playing music in one of these, circles around a fire where drugs may or may not be getting done. Maybe there's truth to the idea that philosophy is just reminding us of stuff that we already knew, but only in a trivial way, like in the way that our consciousness is the same as the electrons. Like, when was the last time you talked to an electron? Come on. Okay, is consciousness something you can get more of? Like maybe a Tibetan yogi would have more consciousness. Okay, so again, depends on definition, right? So when I say consciousness, I'm saying it quantum mechanics to try to convince people to embrace panpsychism on the level of instrumentalism. So that is consciousness, and conscious would just basically be definitionally adjacent to extant doctrines in quantum mechanics. So consciousness would be the process, and conscious would be I can't actually even remember, which is honestly embarrassing, but yeah, so one is the process and one is the potential to undergo the process. So matter stores energy. So the process of waveform reduction, which I thought of a good metaphor for waveform reduction, is actually blinking. So the reason I've sort of not, I don't know if anyone is even aware that this is a source of tension, but I will always say waveform reduction instead of wave function collapse, because when you have as much consciousness as we do, what's happening is nowhere near collapse. So you think of the electron in the diffraction and the single slit, right? That I always come back to, single slit, because that's one sort of end of it. Single slit, that would be where you have the most collapse. That's the level on which the instrumentation is interfering, aka the matter, the mass, the slit is interfering maximally with the moving mass, which is the electron. That's where you could say, well, it's a collapse because it's broken from some type of symmetry. And then you say, well, symmetry is this certain type of geodesic, aka a straight line between 2 points. It's a shit argument. I'm not saying I would use it. I'm just saying, for example. So, blah, blah, blah. In this case, conscious would be something that is spontaneously created through evolution, which is spontaneously generated through the closure of the atmosphere. So we're always undergoing the process. And the capacity to undergo the process builds and builds and builds and builds. And there are quantum states which correspond to these various living fossil type animal morphologies. I'm sort of saying, like, there could be a change in the consciousness configuration, but we're talking, like basically Transformers tier, even more than that, perhaps quantum state transition that will just happen one time. And I don't want to say come out of the left field, but yeah. Whether the yogi has more consciousness, that's not the way to look at it, because the yogi isn't trying to get the most consciousness, because that doesn't actually mean anything, because the incarnated soul is subject to finite matter, which always enters into canonical conjugation relations with its objects of whatever simulation or whatever you want to call them. So it's more of different, quote, properties of consciousness that the yogi has versus the normal person. So think of it as like expansion packs. So do you have like 3 tools in your expansion pack or a gajillion? And most people have 1. And being in 1 is like very not good. Like even just getting a second is so much better than just a single one, because there's, effectively, there's 3 plus 1. Yes, that we're 11 dimensional, but that's basically saying, well, we're 11 dimensionally rendering something that's essentially 3 plus 1. So how much consciousness you ultimately experience while incarnate depends on how much and the type of food you eat. Pretty much that's it. It's pretty much just the food that you eat. And then obviously digestion is going to come into it too. So I don't want to say everyone has the exact same amount of consciousness, or that being vegetarian decreases your amount of consciousness. That is not true at all. There is a way to understand how this works. It's already established. It's called Ayurveda. It's medicine. Like, I don't need to sort of reinvent the wheel. And I'm happy to like point people in that direction. I do have experience as a hobbyist, because I'm trying to gather, metadata for my own explanations and such. So the technology is sort of, I'm leading to what the point is, I guess, that the yogic technology is, that's what it's there for, is to give you conscious effects. So it's never really, I don't know that physics, like, because physics has never denied consciousness before, now to now reintegrate consciousness into physics, I suppose wouldn't ever have been done either. Meme says, apparently the moon used to have a magnetic field over twice as strong as the Earth is now. I'd be curious to know how that inference was made, because I got to sort of be careful with the headline, the attention grabbers. Are they really saying something, or is this just an interpretational fantasy? So yeah, you're not just looking at a pure maximization of consciousness. You're looking at technology designed with particular states of consciousness in mind to ultimately transcend all states of consciousness. So going through so many different places, that the process of going place to place is itself the information you become identified with. So yeah, does it all boil down to a good definition of information? Well, I don't think it's solved definitionally. I think that at some point it just has to be asserted that because consciousness is absolute, it's not going to lend itself to an explanation that by the end of it you're going to just nod and say, oh yeah, I get it. Okay. Again, so moon rocks, though, that doesn't, I don't really get what you mean by moon rocks there. I don't want to get too, I want to stay grounded, memes, in what can be validated. And a lot of this stuff cannot be. So it does not bode well for credence. Like, I understand making jokes, okay? But like, credence matters. Short time, a billion-ish years. It's like interpretation. Okay, let's get on the page. So the contemplation of the form of the periodic table is a training. So you don't really need somebody to initiate you to visualize the periodic table. And you can use technology to help yourself visualize it. And it helps you think 3 plus 1 dimensionally. So I guess the periodic table could be like a way to sort of hollow yourself out for eventual knowledge that you're after, that's some, more specific thing that the people who are, mostly erroneously chasing drugs looking for. Yeah, so I don't really want to look at like moon rocks here, please. So I didn't really intend to, like, I didn't make this planning on sharing it with this person. I just want to show the value of not committing to a single logic, because it is a lot more helpful to just accept that a finite number of logics are resolvable, but it is unclear whether a secular language can resolve them. Clearly, you needed more than just a secular language to get to this periodic table thing, but the sum is greater than the parts in that it draws the connection between the micro and macro as 3 plus 1, and we can all agree 3 plus 1 is the things we observe. Now we can argue that we observe more than 3 spatial and 1 temporal dimension, but we can't really argue that those things have their origin of our discovery of them in time, but that we perceive them essentially as atemporal. And that is really good place to focus on, to realize that there's a domain of things that is self, I suppose, hidden, more so than most things. And the more fundamental it is, the more hidden it is. And so music is more fundamental because it can access several attributes of this same level of the field. And so this extremely abstract level that this is not even hilariously, this isn't even like, the people who are philosophical, allegedly monists. This isn't even monist. Like, if you want to do monism, you got to start with one thing, At least I'm starting with 3 plus 1 thing. That's what I'm saying. Like, in 3 plus 1 things, I'm not arguing, but in my own experience, the 3 plus 1 stuff, most people, that's not going to a level where it's accessible day to day on the level that I can access it. So it doesn't mean other people can't, it just means it's going to take time. So that's another issue. So I guess math and music could be thought of as the same vector distance from this, I don't want to say Tao, but it's the first thing that comes to mind. Again, words can only point at things. Yeah, so enjoy this. This isn't even talking about music yet, but I think if I do these types of diagrams, then the music stuff will be easier. Like, literally not even, I haven't even bridged that gap yet. I'm just like starting to build a tiny bit of a bridge. Anyway, hope this is fun for like literally anybody watching it. Because I guess, let's see, I'm having All right, I'm having trouble locating this thing so that I can move it a little bit. Here we go. One thing that always comes back as a question, along with the why is the moon exactly lining up with the sun during a lunar eclipse? Eclipses in general, why do they always line up to perfect? You know, that's pretty weird, isn't it? Is that a coincidence? Can that be a coincidence? And another one is like, why do we only have whatever? Maybe we have 4 brains, but let's say we have 1 brain for the sake of argument. Why do we have 1 brain and 2 eyes, and so on and so forth? So I think if we make various simulations of these superpositions that can be precipitated from this crystal, they have to be a certain type, obviously. And I'm not saying that this hyperbolic lattice is necessarily the right type. I'm just saying it's in the right direction, because you kind of want something that you can intuitively span the space with. Like, I guess it's a bit different for me because I already know how many properties these things have from studying a system that is all about low cardinality, aka irreducibly complex, decompositions, aka chunkings of, well, in this case, it's personality archetypes, but also flavors, because those are the same subdiscipline. So I was thinking that various little drawings could be a metaphor for smell. And I don't know, like salty and stuff. Like, you could draw them as little color in lines. I'm not saying that it's all meant to be therapeutic coloring in lines. I'm just saying, like, people love to spend a lot of time on computers, and you might as well be not rotting your brain completely to dust when you're doing that, and finding ways to be creative. I don't want to say building meaning, but I'm sure that's what it feels like for some. It's great. Myths are also a source with which one develops one's perspective, who one should ideally recognize. They are just an apparatus one can use to exercise the mind, or merely metaphorical. See, one thing is, like, there's way too much emotion. Okay, just in the general reasoning process, it's not healthy to be reasoning with that much pressure on emotion. Like, you know, what is something like? I guess I like to look at the summary of any type of story. And if it doesn't have a really strong moral, then I sort of question the value. So something like the Odyssey just doesn't speak to me. Like, what is the moral there? It sort of blurs the line, almost. I don't get it. So I love myths because you can compress a lot of moral lessons in them, and it just gives you a lot of ways to I don't know, I don't know what it is that I like about myths, but I guess for the same reason people like video games, I like myths. Like, I can just lose myself in them forever, and that they don't get old. Who's emotional here? No one in particular is emotional, but the manner in which people generally reason is highly emotional on a level it oughtn't be. If we want to make reasoning accessible to everyone, it needs to be maximally non-triggering of emotions, but also minimally counterintuitive. So that's like a very fine balance. That's a bit of a landing the jet on the dime conundrum. Yes, of course, everyone loves a great story, sure. And stuff like any type of what they call synchronicity is kind of cool. I guess coincidence, synchronicity, or I don't know. Things that imbue with a sense of meaning. They were talking about on the Qualia Institute thing about the valence of certain states. So, yeah, I mean, dipping into the classics, like, you gotta love dipping into the classics, but nobody knows what the classics are. So, I don't like to be reminded of the Gulf sometimes, and myths just, I don't know. They do that sometimes. They remind me of, like, yeah. Anyway, everyone loves a good story, but what one believes to be a good story is sort of different. I don't know how much I mentioned this before, but like, I remember how, I don't know how many times I've said this, but like, you don't want to say that electrons, like, it was the reason I like this meme was because it was like, it's basically pet rock tier to say that electrons have feelings. It's like, well, I mean, if you want to be big tent pet rockism, yes, I have a pet rock, and an electron has one or two incredibly rudimentary feelings. Then it's just a question of, well, what's the utility of that particular belief? There you go. So, I don't really have much else. I'm trying to think. Oh no, I still have a couple of articles I could go through if people are so interested, or if, or I can just wrap up, whatever. No, it looks like Doovid's still on screen on this one. Uh, this is great. And I have no idea what's going to happen, but I'm just going to keep going with, I guess, whatever other people are interested in, because that's so much easier. I'm going to try to balance it out, because obviously I think there's some stuff that I do that's important, but yeah, I got to keep myself interested too. So that's my number one thing. Getting into or optimizing the potential for, quote, flow state, aka the result may not be great, but it feels reasonably good when I'm producing it. And then there's obviously just going to have to be tons of corrections for a lot of things. Like, a meme is a single integral thing. So when that comes to me, it's just, I have it in my head, and I can just make like a 2-word thing, like in Seinfeld, where he couldn't remember the joke, except I can easily remember the joke. It's just super easy, and then maybe have to like make it. Like, I didn't make this meme or whatever, but if I want to do that, but if I want to write something, yeah. So tricking myself into feeling like I'm not writing a bunch of time wasty garbage, that's really high on the priority list, because I don't have the same level of I don't know if Doovid would call it resolve or what. I'm just going to quickly my crashing the thing again to load these pictures and have the OBS going. Crashing it again. All right. There you go. Back to the show. It's fun just to write, if only to put it through the gender analyzer, if only to analyze your own reaction to it. Okay. what hadn't I got to? I don't think I actually talked about the friendly fungi announcing itself to hosts. I don't really read through this much either, but I'm really wondering. And this is just, I think, honestly, it's a huge development in terms of understanding self-reference. Like, I think you're meaningfully, coherently measuring self-referential systems. And so here we're self-reference is on the level of, there's the host, which has its self-reference, which is then interrupted by the fungi entering and then sort of harmonizing with that self-reference. And so this is great because maybe friendliness can be a way to know if fungus is good or not going forward. So that's another example of, science. If you have one example or several examples in a study, at what point do you make the inductive leap? Well, sometimes when it's super reasonable, I'm not saying always make the inductive leap right away, but sometimes there's no reason not to make the inductive leap with stuff like entanglement. It's like, well, yeah, entanglement makes total sense because the argument pro entanglement is there's no preferred direction. Okay, there's actually two arguments there. There's no preferred direction 3D or 3 plus 1D. If people are making the argument on the 3 plus 1D, you can be pretty clear that it's a solid on the 3D. So you're essentially denying that to deny at least a degree of entanglement. Measurement doesn't preclude entanglement. Maybe measurement is its own type of entanglement, but I do think the ultimately best way to understand this is that measurement is a temporary break in entanglement. Yeah, exactly. If the mushrooms are plotting against us, we should know. Geez, it's a bit ominous, isn't it? Yeah. So friendliness. So this announcing itself. So then it's a question of, well, what does it mean to announce itself, and then sort of opening the door to just focus on the boundary interaction and, well, how do we best model boundary interaction, and is there even a boundary interaction happening, and so on and so forth. Think of it like a calibration. There's really a reasonable starting point, and you have candida yeast that's as far as we understand necessary to digestion. I'm trying to think if I think I already talked about this one, so I won't go over it again. Let's see here. And this one is just like cool. There's really nothing to this other than it being mathematically cool. So I'll see if I can get it to render. There we go. So this is a great example of how ropes are a good model. Are you taking notes, Bill Gade? Are you taking some notes here? Here's the thing. If people are actually studying history and philosophy, they should notice that beliefs don't really necessarily reflect reality. You could argue some of these things are sort of a test to see how much belief can mold reality. Not going to name any names in terms of some of these ideas, but bang, Doooovid. So I would point to this and say, well, first of all, it's got a really cool effect at the end. I don't know if that's actually continuous. It looks like it is because they're not tied up anywhere, so there's no reason why they couldn't sort of flow through each other like that, even though it looks like, oh, well, wouldn't they get tangled up? Right, so it's just a model. So what is this a model for? Okay. Well, ultimately, everything's happening within the QMPT, and there's a superposition of possible superpositions in the QMPT. And that's your basic like simulator of everything. And then it's just too much to understand at once. So we just have to break it down with models, and cross-model comparison is where the actual learning starts. And there is eventually integral top-down modeling that can be accessed through traditional modalities. But what I really like about this one is just the sheer degree of symmetry, the contrast in the colors, and the way that, okay, it really is a great model for something that is bounded. Now, this doesn't actually have any correspondence to reality. What it is an example of why and how ropes can demonstrate certain symmetry principles. Because, you know, when you don't, when you sort of take a stance against absolutism, which is what non-dualism is arguing is doing, there is no one formula. But the universe is subject to a conservation of a certain type of information, and then it's sort of down to giving a definition of information, which requires there's sort of a gap there that, if you're not actually kind of looking for the answer, that's going to be hard, like for it to find you stuff that has been established as being of a certain class of knowledge historically, traditionally. It's not likely to deviate from that anytime soon. So I'm glad that I see stuff like what Skyworks just wrote, like just sort of trying it out. The way I would look at it is that English wasn't designed for quantum mechanics. Even if it were, the concepts in the language can only really point to the process. And the idea is to use a jargon that makes that self-evident as quickly as possible, and also allows you to establish, like, it'd be nice to think that everyone's good faith. Just because, I mean, why not? But if someone is unable to make a connection on the informational level that's required in order to have a concept of simulation, you want to establish that as quickly as possible at the same time. So Skyworks says measurement is the observation of entangle. Let's just stick on this diagram for a minute. What does it mean to be entangled? So you can think of it start as the flat, the lollipop. So it goes from a lollipop to like, so the colors are fully connected, like they're fully overlapping at first. Okay, right, like now, okay. The colors at that point when I said now, they were like totally entangled in a plane. Okay. And then they became disentangled. But in so becoming disentangled from that flat plane, undertook what could also be described as an entanglement. But it's no longer a flat plane, it's biconical, and it's got level of the colors. Okay, the colors have been separated. So if energy equals degree of separation of colors, well, motion just gave you energy. Now, this isn't pointing to anything at all. This is pointing to the fact that matter, we can't disprove that matter is pure cause, and therefore all attempts to pose any type of understanding on something that is non-dual, I don't want to say they're non-starters on the level of their subliminal axioms, but that fact operates even for stuff like, what could be argued to be beyond math because it's also physical. That still doesn't get you to the level of certainty that certain people want to say is associated with empiricism. That's not what empiricism is saying. All empiricism is doing is painting itself to a corner of how little the domain actually applies. It's doctrine. Sorry, I said that wrong. Meme says, reminds me of the PBS spacetime video on electron spin or the asymmetric Clifford torus. Well, it's like you don't have to guess really. It's like, well, we have to be able to account for unity and symmetry. But the question is, how many degrees of symmetry are there? And there's a limit not to symmetry, not to forces, but to dimensionality on the level of observability. Simultaneous observability has a limit of 3 plus 1, and 3 plus 1 state is disallowed. And the complement to the 3 plus 1 state is allowed on a statistical basis, which is where you can come in and argue that that is the same as a simulation. So it's not that I don't want to embrace these terms necessarily, but I won't unless I can validate that it is somehow meaningful. And I like to go with just vibrational. So as you can see, this one possibly motion sickness inducing diagram here. Yeah, it's really, you could argue just a vibrational mode. That doesn't actually inherit because it represents something that could be physical, doesn't actually inherit the normal metaphysics of stuff that we see portrayed in R3. Hopefully that wasn't too boring. Now, so people are wondering how and what, I mean, I don't know if anyone cares to know why I think the things I do or how, but I definitely did go pretty deep into some of these topics back in the day. I like to have an ongoing education, so at the end of university, I just picked up Ayurvedic medicine, but obviously wanted to have it adapted to like practical, useful for day-to-day stuff. You know, I don't really see myself as a doctor per se. So this would be traditionally what would be studied if one were going to be a doctor, but if you know theoretically you want to lean more towards the philosophy, like at least you kind of want to have a very basic understanding, and you just sort of realize quickly that you know one of these schools, you know, is already saying like the consciousness is fundamental. So if I was completely whatever, what do they call it? If I wanted to do Mad Dog Vedanta, just say I don't even need to study consciousness. I can just point to this, and yeah, I'll be fine. Just I thought I actually bookmarked this page, but it doesn't look like I did. But you know, it's definitely a fact that panpsychism, at least some form of panpsychism, is intrinsic to Ayurveda, but they don't really reference it directly because, like, you can imagine someone like going to the doctor or psychologist, all upset, and then they're like, well, electrons have feelings, and then there's maybe one person in 10,000 that would be comic humor that would actually heal their the woe in their soul. But for the other 9,999, that may not work. All right, well, I'm having trouble finding exactly where it says it, but I can definitely point to somewhere in here that says that consciousness is fundamental. And I should have, you know, bookmarked this before the show, but yeah, there you go. It's sort of like, I guess you could sort of derive it yourself by saying like, I don't know, just I guess thinking about it. Every property that can't be ascribed to your person, to your subject, to your limited properties, like has to be a universal property. So like some scriptures even go even further and will say, like, well, there's actually a universal ego. So luckily that's not the case in my thing. So yeah, I think it's actually this one. Me mom stuff that talks about consciousness is fundamental, or like very easy to sort of take the interpretation in that way. So it's just basically talking about a type of absolute reality. God is a universal being, as a totality, and you have various metaphors about reflection and so forth. And so, yeah, there's always going to be one drop of the ultimate in the mundane. It's just a matter of looking for it. And if you already know what the drop of the ultimate in the mundane feels like, then it's basically, trivially easy to locate it in language. So when I can say something like panpsychism is true, that doesn't mean the universe has an ego. It just means that the way English is set up is that based on a definition of consciousness that nobody could really functionally disagree with, it follows that everything else is conscious. And the reason is because we don't have any way to put a barrier between ourselves and non consciousness. We actually could do that. We could say, well, only life is conscious. And then you have a very obvious boundary, or at least it makes the boundary somewhat easier. There are still issues, but I think that's mostly resolved. So the fact of panpsychism, just to be clear here, that's the fact of English. So I do think there's value to panpsychism on some level. But if it's causing confusion, it's probably something we should rethink. We want to minimize the confusion. We want to have evidence of learning. So if we have this more precise definition of consciousness as something, we're going to say, oh, it's only conscious if it's alive. Well, then panpsychism is not true anymore. And so you have a situation of the universe being proto-conscious, and then the consciousness starts once there's a folding. And a folding, again, is the binding problem. Saying, like, well, this is the field over which the bound energy responsible for the animation of life acts. So just based on the fact that it admits this type of decomposition, the fact that there must be something that connects the two, but also that God is essentially tautological, that the word can't really be God, it's the transcendental connective. Like, you could call that the trivial transcendental connective. Because someone who already believes in God, you can easily kill the God. What that means is another story, but like, it's, people aren't really convinced through reason to God. It's more, it's either a conclusion of a bunch of reasoning, or it's just an abstraction that you sort of grow towards and away from, either in utility of or whatever. But ultimately, that one wouldn't be useful, but the consciousness one would be, because it's actually an intuitive process. And so that was why I was sort of lured into saying to T-Jump, like, well, you can't disprove that the universe is conscious, not because I mean, partially it was kind of hilarious to be able to say something that's so easily misunderstood, but that's another story. Anyway, yeah, so that wasn't because of some, quote, spooky belief that I had. That was just because I knew, based on extant doctrines, more or less what parameterizations were allowable versus how well understood. Because you got to realize, like, the stuff's just not well understood. And when stuff isn't well understood, it's the same as vague. So vague definitions, everything's subject to canonical conjugations. There's actually a strength and a weakness to everything. So the strength of vague definitions that applies to a lot of things, broad, and the weakness of a vague definition is basically the same as the strength. Like if it's so general, it applies to everything, and everything we recognize is due to contrast. Well, there's an argument that it's meaningless, which is what I got to allude to, and I never really got to get that far in a sort of technical explanation as to why, even though there's multiple ways to do a monistic decomposition, that every single monistic decomposition that I've attempted has been incoherent to the vast majority of people that I've had the opportunity to sort of, I don't even want to necessarily say that we shared meaning, but we were talking about the subject of the conversation was the possibility of not sharing meaning. And it's just not a lot of precedent for me to point to say, let's go with a monistic, let's go with, like, for example, like micropsychism, just everything is conscious. And if that's the thing we're going to look at, then it's just going to be degrees of self-reference and conscious. So what does it mean for something to be consciousness self-referent in the first degree? Well, it's just inconceivable, right? So those things should be available and to the people who want to study them, but also acknowledging that they're just not. There may yet come a day, this basically Buddhist argument, like Buddhism may go mainstream at some point, but it's like, okay, if that happens, that's great. I have serious doubts, and one of the issues is the coherence of going from a one element system to, there's no precedent for that, to go from a one element. We're scarcely getting by with many element systems. So this is a 5 element system. It's not something people are particularly sympathetic to in any way, and it's significantly easier than a 1 element system. So that's sort of where I've become convinced that a consciousness-based ontology isn't going to be practicable because no one is going to understand it. And so there's going to have to be some sort of model that is minimally interferential on the process of consciousness. So acknowledge consciousness is super complicated. Know the reasons why, and also know the reasons, like the study of why consciousness is so complicated is actually a pretty interesting study. And that's where you can learn a lot about neti-neti, successive negation, sorry. That's an integral part of learning. And it's a good place for beginners to start, because it's most similar to the Socratic method. Beings dip their fingers into collective accumulated consciousness and form their own perceived model that are adaptive of previous imagined models. Okay, so we were talking about emotional thinking before. We want to cut down what we're saying. We want to use as few words as possible. It does seem like the term that is going to end up encompassing most of these things in terms of physics and machines is information. So information is going to be sort of the generic, and then various domains will adapt information. So we'll have information and form arising with geometry, and then properties are going to be your eigenstates of that. So right now, computationally, a lot of problems because we can't get the eigenstates, and it's sort of like obvious that the power is the eigenstates, the ability to resolve a system into its, minimally entangled, aka orthogonal, approximately orthogonal components. So yeah, I personally love this stuff. I came up with this diagram a long time ago, at least 10 years ago. And it reminds me of a Venn diagram, and I was just trying to pack as much information as possible into it. And it extremely packed because I can also point to things about the measurement limit in it and say, well, like, look at the degree of information compression going on. Note, I didn't invent any of this stuff. This is really just a catalog that I made. So this isn't not to be confused with my own actual works, but I would argue this is quantum mechanical. And so a consciousness first model, you can argue, is also quantum mechanical, and just say, well, consciousness is waveform reduction and conscious is waveform energy. And then those two things go together, and that's it. And what it means is not whatever you want it to mean, but all the data you're ever going to be interpreting is in the context of that. And it's just a question of, well, what particular tessellation, what particular arrangement of that dimensional limit is most conducive to conveying the fact that a lot of the stuff you have to do is like, find it funny that Doovid said that there's no element of persuasion. It's like there's clearly persuasion involved when, like, just for example, think of it on the level of a flat Earth. You look around, it seems flat, and then you want to argue that it's round. You have to persuade someone that their immediate experience is not the ultimate deciding factor as to form, aka information. All right, so Skyward says, how do you build your models unless you draw from the pool of previous models? Well, that's the problem of strong induction. Okay, so revelation is the solution to that. And you can say, well, it's not really a solution. And I would just say, well, it's self-demonstrated through the integral periodic table knowledge. And, that because it's so fun to work with and intuitive from being 3 + 1, it's usable by more people, and that's a strength. So how do I build models is I don't build models. I pray and I work on surrendering to the will of God, because I know through whatever experience that it's sort of a fool's errand to deny what I guess you could describe as the laws of physics. So that's just like, not to sort of purity spiral or anything, but the beliefs do affect how much you can conceive of these things and how much you can conceive affects imagination, and imagination ultimately affects the degree to which you can simulate, because you're simulating the model, you're iterating it several times, and the goal is to keep, we're sort of incorporating multiple periodic table stamps, but we're not really including any new information. We're just generating models or approximations, or like I really want these to be mostly intuitive. So if these aren't intuitive, I hope people will say so that I can work on making them more intuitive. I'm worried about this one that, like, you just can't really see the color, so I'm going to zoom in a little bit. And the idea with this was just sort of making my own coloring book, but also not having to color it in that much and letting the computer do the thinking for me with regards to coloring it in, but also, using it to visualize the thing, because I guess one of the things I struggle with is the visualization in higher dimensions. Probably everybody does, but I've definitely met enough people who could do it better than me to know that I'm particularly bad at it. So yeah, how do you, what's wrong with what's wrong with the drawing on previous models? There's nothing wrong with that. Um, that's what science kind of is based on, is drawing on a pool of previous models. I mean, there's issues with that because it presumes that everything is already known and there is evolution. So there's just no way that the pre-existing models can be complete. And the answer to why is, strangely enough, evolution. Things are changing all the time. Obviously, things are way more complicated. And there's no new absolute information because there's a conservation of energy, conservation of information in the absolute sense. But because there's more configurations of matter, well, sure, there's more models to be made. And yes, there's nothing new under the sun, but also, I don't know, looks new enough to me. New enough to me. So it's a question of what is the pool of previous models? And I'm saying go past having a pool of previous models. Allow yourself the possibility that you can go past that. You're past a pool. You're swimming in the ocean. Okay? That's what I'm trying to make that point at the very beginning, is that your belief about what is possible is, you don't know on what level it's self-fulfilling a priori. Maybe I have some idea, you don't know, there's no way to know again. The tools, the process, like, not to sound cheesy, but like the highest art is no art thing and the highest form is no form. One of the meanings behind that is that, like, it's better to know 2 or 3 or 4 languages. It's better to know multiple ways to approach something than just one. But it's not better necessarily to know 71 languages than 70 languages. Okay. 3 plus 1, there's a limit. But we are not 3 plus 1 in complexity in an absolute sense, because that would mean nothing mattered to us except space and time, right? So let's just sort of remember what it is. It's a guiding principle. 3 is important in materialism because it builds crystals. 3 plus 1 is important. 4 is important because it builds space-time. And then beyond 3 plus 1 is important because that will account for all the different stars in the cosmos, because not all regions of the cosmos are temporal, even though everything we as humans have access to is, for all intents and purposes, temporal. But as you can see, using a non-time facing model like QMPT, because it doesn't change with time, using that as the stamp, that's atemporal, allows you to cram the pimpage of higher information density, yet maintaining a low absolute complexity. And the virtue of low absolute complexity really can't be overstated. It's hyper-Roolead turtles all the way down. Which turtle are we on the back of? That's what I want to know. Because honestly, like, okay, let me just see here. Are you asking what is the correspondence between our field of vision and reality? Because I'm thinking, like, I don't think I'm there yet, but these seem to be that these things in the middle eventually become eyes. So there's a starting point, which is your QMPT. And then there's your ending point, which is going to be something like an 11-dimensional. And again, this is an anecdote, so we can't be sure, but something like an 11-dimensional rendering that has these things as a starting point. No, wait. I don't know if I can go over. Whoopsie. All right. Let's just reset this thing here. Got my poor computer. It's just, whoop. There we go. It's really trying. Like, I hope that it's inaudible, but I can hear it really whirring. All right. So all that to say, there may not be any way to go from, it just might be like precluded by being human that like, okay, because we can conceive of the QMPT somewhat, like obviously I'm not the one who discovered the periodic table. So it's like, you know, there's the question as to whether anything is ultimately conceivable in any way whatsoever, but we're working with like the secular definition, which is that people agree that they understand that they're talking about the same thing. Okay. Oh my God, memes. Guess what? Simple and complex. They're probably going to end up having dependent arising. This is so cool about that stuff. Like, I never thought of that, but that ends up being pretty interesting. Yeah. Okay. My brain doesn't necessarily go pow. Like, I've had the pow experiences. If you're talking about like the sort of giant sort of forehead feeling, like brain automatically swelling. I have had that feeling when I was really thinking hard about something. Like when I was first making those big discoveries about the periodic table, it felt like that. But now, when I'm more doing stuff that I actually super much enjoy, like contemplation and meditation and talking about the same topic for many hours in a row and reading scripture, it feels like bubbles. And I don't know if I can be more specific than that. It's okay. I actually did go in one of those things, like those egg things. I don't know if anyone's ever heard of that. It's like a sensory deprivation tank. It didn't really work out very well for me. My skin is a bit sensitive, so it got like uncomfortable quickly. But that, if it was a qualia, it didn't feel horribly itchy due to saline content. It's a part metaphor, I suppose. But I think it's reasonable to assume as a starting point that because we can conceive of the QMPT, that we cannot conceive of what you're saying, because to do so would contradict the like nature of our conscious experience, the subjective experience. That's a subset. And so to say we could like magnify into our consciousness from the hyperset or whatever you want to call it may be the same thing as saying that we can experience the full incarnate consciousness as it is, which like contradicts the observer effect. So there's a difference between, you know, having perfectly neutral consciousness to having the ability to, like, there's just certain things that are structurally unknowable, because what it means to know something is a waveform reduction that over time can render an object that is QMPT-esque. But we can't render the QMPT in nature. It's the template within which the natural renderings are taking place. So in terms of whether God is simple or complex, it's like, obviously, I bet everyone knows what I'm about to say. It's down to definition. And a definition of God, I'd say you're already outside of science. Arguably, you're out of philosophy. You're into theology, and that's fine. It's just that not everybody wants to talk about theology. And if you're going to actually have productive philosophy, aka like science, positive philosophy, theology, if it's going to be in it, like, it really needs to be justified. So I would argue that this type of God, if we're going to say God's the universe, and then like the microcanonical God is the QMPT, it's the ground of complexity. And its numerology is simple because its numerology is 3 plus 1, but it is more than just 3 plus 1 because it has 118 states. So I have to do a special counting technique to go from 3 plus 1 to 118. So why is this so great? Well, it really makes my point really strongly because I can say that the amount of information between 3 plus 1 and 118 is somehow preserved. So there's automatically boundaries that are metaphysical. So they're pan-experimental. They're hopefully integral to the number system. So to understand simplicity and complexity is just to understand the role that the QMPT plays in causality, but also the potential that it has as, I'm not sure if the word is a tesselant, but basically as the stamp of a hyperbolic tessellation that ends up just being a really good I suppose it's my equivalent of a tabula rasa, a ground. All right, I'm trying to move this thing around, but for some reason I have about, it's basically like the same problem as with my internet, that I have like infinity different things loaded on OBS and I haven't actually bothered to like clear any of them out. I just always open a new one, so it's like, oh, okay, I have 300 of these things, so that'd be great. Yeah, drink, savor, absorb, and refine. That's a good way to go out. But yeah, I suppose I could talk about the infinity, or sorry, the complexity thing a lot. But now that sort of just like mull it over for a couple seconds, I should probably catalog a list of these dependently arising, apparently opposite, but actually complementary concepts, and simple and complex might be a way to bring in the QMPT as a type of ground, because again, coming back to consciousness, and it's like, well, maybe actually we can have a doctrine of consciousness if we assert off the bat that it's really counterintuitive, and we say, okay, well, the class of forms that can model consciousness, those are things that their boundaries vibrate, because that's our definition of consciousness. This QMPT doesn't necessarily have a vibrating boundary. So if I think of it as a non-vibrating boundary, that's not conscious. As soon as I think of it as having a vibrating boundary, it's conscious. But guess what? This thing can never be conscious, only a subset of it. So you have like this proper delineation between vibrating and what I describe as like the ground of vibration. So you informationally, if you want to have a situation where it's information is neither created or destroyed, but rather information selectively polarizes matter through evolution. This is the way to approach it. So how's my I'd love to get some feedback as to whether this is any more persuasive, because I'm partially working on like not even my own passion projects, just like trying to facilitate other people's at this point, but also for my own personal, I'm trying to get better at monologuing / persuasion. So if anyone has any feedback on that, it would be very appreciated. You can have a think about it. Yes, very nice bubble gum. Very nice. We have a less of a language we can incorporate into this. Is like verb implies action, process relational. So I don't know if anyone's noticed, but the whole definitional regress, that's solved by process relations, because process relations stand true apart from any definitional regress. interest you can impose upon them. They don't transcend semantic digression. They make it possible to have multi-level semantic digressions, and that'll get you on the path. It's not even about agreeing. It's perhaps about agreeing to disagree, as seeing agreements or lack of an alignment not as something that is because of something intellectual, but rather something emotional. God is a simpler definition or describer, but is anthropomorphized to give the source an identity one can simply understand. I mean, there's infinity arguments pro God. Like, there's honestly, I could come up with probably 100 arguments for God right now, but then it's like, that's actually not being scientific. Why? Because people aren't convinced. And if they get like, there's this diminishing returns, and it goes beyond diminishing returns IRL, because someone gets the vibe that you're being dishonest, then they'll recoil. So, yeah. God stuff, when people are arguing for God, that's just wishful thinking. I think there is an argument to be made for transcendental knowledge requiring a theological origin, but at the same time, the manner in which that fact is presented requires finesse, delicateness, because no one necessarily is going to know your intention behind why you did something, because people are mostly caught up in their own reflections in terms of describing motives. But if you do something and you're claiming it's for a good reason, you should probably be able to back it up. Because you shouldn't insist that other people agree. It's really just God thing is more than just an aesthetic preference. It has a lot of secular, aka day-to-day mundane life baggage. It's semantic on the level that, way back, label God got slapped on some abstraction that may or may not have had an actually consistent meaning, and then there's evolution of language, and you sort of have to ask, what do people mean when they're talking about God? And we've seen this surely happen at least once, where someone asks for a definition and the person gets really upset because it's like, well, it should just be obvious. Like, somebody on the T-Show server literally saying, well, I'm using the colloquial definition of consciousness. It's like, you're literally saying nothing, okay? Because the whole brain magically poofs out consciousness thing and other theories, aka certain forms of dualism, they're not even mutually compatible. So no, when there's the possibility of mutually incompatible definitions, or vaguely related at best definitions, it is imprudent in the highest degree to presuppose a shared understanding simply on the basis of not wanting to expose the fact that, you're not an expert on consciousness, and pointing to, quote, peer-reviewed study doesn't establish fuck all, and you're not in a position to, essentially judge. So I've definitely gotten pissed at people for going into too much definitional regress, because, who hasn't had a kid ask them why 50 million times? It's a bit like the PSR. It's like, at some point, there's the impression of an intentional non-learning or non-listening. And I don't think anyone can really disagree with that. That's expected, because if you're assuming that everything should be, quote, empirical, aka verifiable with the senses, that's pretty easy to accidentally interpret that as feels dictates reality, which clearly that's only true on one level and not true on a bunch of levels. Because if we actually had access to the truth, okay, there's one effing periodic table. If we essentially had access to the truth, we wouldn't disagree on anything. Is that the case? It's not the case. Does the QMPT look like an inverted octahedron? Well, I think that a circle, this circle in particular, reminds me a little bit of at least something with a four-fold symmetry. It's actually a really cool shape. Like, the more I look at it, the more sort of detailed it gets. But I don't know if you can see that there's, okay, there's like a triangle on the left here. And then it's a bit more than, it's like almost like 4 squares mashed together. And then another triangle. So there's like 4 sort of holes. There's like a hole here, and I'm probably not really illustrating this very well. There's, anyway, let's not accidentally crash my computer again. But yeah, there's all sorts of fun things to notice. And yeah, this one in particular, I just thought was a good starting point because it kind of reminds me of, if you ever take a bath and then you let the bath fill up and you very slowly lie back so that the line of the water is tickling its way up your hair. It kind of gives that like really tingly feeling. This thing reminds me of that somehow. I don't know why, but when I do that, not like I've done that in a while, but I remember doing it as a kid, sort of going into the tingling and the shift in perspective sort of gives this, it's almost like a way to trick yourself into an optical illusion of consciousness where you can temporarily directly experience the brain's enormous biasing effect on consciousness. Because one of the biases, one of the major bias of the brain is the illusion of unbiasedness, right? That's where the whole regularity of the field comes from. Yeah, exactly. Bubblegum knows what I'm talking about. Like, did you see his latest video? It was literally like, I don't know if it was quite 2 hours, but it was shapes and colors, therefore God. It's like, are you really going to spend 2 hours fighting against a triangle? It's like, why? You know? Oh, that reminds me of another thing I wanted to say. I don't think I showed this diagram yet. It's incredibly simple. And it's sort of coming back to my, well, I guess it's mine and Daryl's pet project as to why, if we're going to be building models in a manner that accords with the least action principle, aka Occam's razor, but physics version, we probably want to model things with really simple torsion fields. And I'm kind of saying, like, here's a comparison between your potentially equilateral model, which I see now I have a little dot there in purple, which has no meaning other than a little error. So you've got the one on the left and the one on the right. The one on the right is the Cartesian model with a Pythagorean triangle in it, versus the one on the left is a more, it's like a 3+1 model. Okay, so I don't know if you can see what the 3+1 is. You have your triangle has 3 sides and they're all the same length and 1 circle. So what that's meant to do is to say you've got 3 in the material, 1 in the counter space, and that there's this complementarity between the 3 and the 1 that is a connection with light. And it is extremely, if not impossible, to visualize light on its true path. So we could say, like, as a guiding principle, like visualizing light in its true path is computationally similar to, if not equal to, measuring your own waveform in and of itself, which is precluded by what? Right? Observer effect. What is that? anytime consciousness happens, it changes the waveform. It doesn't collapse it to nothingness. You have some people make it seem like it's an apocalypse every time you think one thought. No, it's the best metaphor for it, honestly, is blinking. That's a waveform reduction. So there's almost no change. So yeah. Self-improvement via yoga is like blinking your way to climbing Mount Everest. So, I mean, I wasn't definitely initially just talking about Leo. I think that I don't tend to single people out like that. I try not to. These are just general problems, um, imbalances. Imbalances are way less problematic if they can be acknowledged. And to expect imbalances to be negated is completely unrealistic. That's where it's out of balance. But to deny them, like, and the point of this diagram here is to say, well, the one on the right is significantly more metaphysically dense than the one on the left. Like, it has more assumption. So to build the thing on the left versus the thing on the right in any way, it's cheaper to build the one on the left. And it's better to layer cheaper, quote, filters or chunkers or whatever. It's just better to layer cheapies, 3+1 cheapies, because if you go past that, you're into the domain of what? Of solutions. Now, we've had enough experience with computation. We should know that what we're after is an optimizing of the eigenvalues, or sorry, optimizing of the process of the diagonalizing, inverting a matrix. We just go one step further and say, well, the reason this is so powerful technology is because there exists a dimensional limit, and then just design everything relative to the dimensional limit. But for, a lot of people, I think what it is they sort of have a certain idea about how complicated something can be. And if someone is coming to them speaking in a way that is not within the band of the ideas they're used to hearing, it's just meaningless. Now, there comes a point where it's like, you choose whether you can understand something or not. Not in all cases. Like, some stuff is really just beyond understanding. Like even in a slightly abstract way, but if your intention is to be understood, it'll work eventually, if the person is in good faith. And then it's like, well, how can everybody be in good faith if not everybody knows what philosophy even is? So to the extent that philosophy involves speaking to normal people, I think is like almost a crash course in why so few people do philosophy. But also, like, eventually working up towards stuff that people who have no initiation to any of this stuff still really feel happy to embrace, because I don't really have a justification for that. I like sharing things, but meaningfully, not just on the basis of, oh, it's cool to look smart. So there kind of has to be a balance. And I hope my ramblings have been entertaining for some of the audience, and I look forward to seeing you next weekend